Tonight, we trace the complete history of Sauron, from the brightest of Aulë's servants to the shadow that nearly swallowed Middle-earth. Thank you to those of you who have been falling asleep with us. If tonight is your first night in Middle-earth, comment night 1 below. Now, let us begin. Before the sun, before the moon, before the first green thing lifted its head above the darkened earth, there was song. And in that song, before he had any name that the peoples of Middle-earth would come to whisper in dread, there was one who listened, one who learned, one who loved the shape of things well made. We know him now by the name the elves gave him after the ruin came, a name that means the abhorred, the abomination, the dread. But he was not born to that name, for the Ainur were not born at all, and in the beginning he was called Mairon, which means the Admirable, and the Admirable he truly was. He was a Maiar, one of the lesser spirits who came into being from the thought of Ilúvatar in the timeless halls before the world was framed. He was not the greatest of that order, for the Valar stood above the Maiar as mountains stand above the foothills. Yet among the Maiar he was accounted mighty, keen in mind, deft in hand, patient beyond the measure of most spirits, and hungry, always hungry, for the deep understanding of how a thing was made and how it might be made better. Of all the great Valar, it was Aulë the smith to whom Mairon was drawn, and to whom in the beginning he gave his service, his loyalty, and the whole bent of his nature. To understand Sauron you must first understand Aulë, for the servant took the shape of the master before ever he was twisted out of true. Aulë was the maker, the delver, the shaper of the substances of Arda, the lord of all crafts, the one who took joy not in possession, but in the act of creation itself. It was Aulë who wrought the mountains as a smith beats iron, who set the gems deep in the roots of the hills, who taught the Noldor of the elves the working of stone and metal in the ages that came after. And in his forges, amid the ringing of hammers and the glow of the deep fires, Aulë delighted in things new and unforeseen, in the beauty of a work brought suddenly into being where before there had been only formless matter. Mairon learned all of this, and he learned it with a fierceness that set him apart. He loved order, and he loved perfection, and he loved the smooth and flawless completion of every task set before his hand. Where another spirit might leave a work rough, content that it should serve, Mairon could not rest until every joint was true, every line was straight, every surface polished to the closing of its purpose. He looked upon a thing unfinished, a thing left ragged, a thing wasteful of effort or motion or substance, and something in him recoiled. For to him disorder was not merely ugly, it was a kind of wound in the fabric of the world that cried out to be healed. There was in the beginning no evil in this. We must be careful here, for it is easy to look back across the long ruin of the ages and imagine that the shadow was always present, coiled and waiting. It was not so. The love of order is not the love of tyranny. The desire for perfection is not the desire for dominion. And the wish to see all things brought to their proper completion is, in its first and purest form, a reflection of the very mind of Ilúvatar, in whom all things are held in their finished glory. Mairon in his early days was a healer of marred things, a coordinator of the labours of others, a spirit who could take 100 scattered efforts and draw them into one smooth and singing whole. The other Maiar of Aulë's household esteemed him. The Valar themselves marked his skill. He was admirable, and he knew that he was admirable, and in that knowing lay the first faint hairline crack through which in the fullness of time the darkness would pour. For consider the nature of his gift, and consider how near it stood to its own undoing. He loved order against chaos, completion against waste, mastery against the fumbling half-measures of lesser hands. And each of these loves was good in the moment of its birth, yet in each of them there was a hunger, and the hunger was for efficiency, for the swift and certain arrangement of all things according to a single guiding will. He looked upon the world, and saw how much was slow, how much was clumsy, how much was left to the wandering choices of many minds that pulled against one another and wasted the labour of the whole. And he thought quietly at first, so quietly that he scarcely knew he thought it. How much better it would all be, how much swifter, how much more perfect, if only one mind, a wise mind, a strong and ordering mind, were set over all. In these earliest days he dwelt with the labours of Aulë and asked for nothing but the work itself. He was not yet a lord of any dark place. He commanded no armies, ruled no realm, held no ring of power in his cunning hand, for the rings were not yet dreamed of, and the wars that would break the shape of the world had not yet been kindled. He was a craftsman among craftsmen, a servant among servants, first perhaps in skill but not in station, and had the tale ended there, it would have been a small and gentle tale, the tale of a bright spirit who loved his work and did it well. But we know that it did not end there. We know the name the elves would give him, and we know the shadow that name would come to mean, from the drowning of islands, to the withering of forests, to the long, slow dread that would lie upon Middle-earth for 3 ages of the world. The seed of all of it was already present, small and folded, and asleep, in the very virtues that made him admirable. His strength was his craft, and his craft would forge the instruments of his tyranny. His virtue was his love of order, and his love of order would harden into the love of control. His gift was his patience, and his patience would let him wait out the centuries, biding, planning, deceiving, while lesser evils spent themselves and fell. We turn now softly from the bright servant in the forges of the Valë and follow him toward the first voice that ever whispered to him of a better way, a swifter way, a way in which his gifts might find their fullest and most terrible expression. For there was another among the great powers of the world who watched Mairon and marked his hunger for order, and understood, as only a fellow spirit could understand, exactly how such a hunger might be turned. His name was Melkor, mightiest of all the Ainur that Ilúvatar had made, the one to whom had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and who had turned those gifts, long before the making of the visible world, against the theme of the great music itself. Where Aulë made in humility, offering his works back to Ilúvatar, Melkor made in pride, or rather he unmade, for he had learned that it was easier to break than to build, easier to mar than to mend, and swifter by far to rule through fear than to serve through love. He desired the world, all of it, the whole of Arda and every living thing within it, not that he might complete it, but that he might possess it, bend it, own it utterly, and suffer no will to move within it save his own. For long ages Melkor had laboured to corrupt the world, in great and violent ways, throwing down what the Valar raised, spoiling what they made fair, kindling wars and cold and cruel fire across the unfinished lands. Yet Melkor was cunning as well as strong, and he understood that the mightiest of his conquests would not be a mountain cast down or a sea set boiling, but a spirit turned, to take one of the admirable, one of the bright and skilful and trusted, one who dwelt in the very household of a Valar, and to bend that spirit slowly to his purpose would be a victory worth more than 100 ruined valleys. And of all the mire, his eye fell upon Mairon. He did not come to Mairon with open evil, for open evil repels the good. And Mairon was still good, still bright, still the servant of the smith. Melkor came instead with agreement. He came speaking the very language of Mairon's own heart, the language of order, of efficiency, of completion. He looked upon the slow and scattered labours of the Valar, upon the way they suffered many wills to grow and wander, and choose, upon the patience with which they let the world unfold in its own uneven time, and he named it what Mairon in his secret thought had already half named it. He called it waste, he called it weakness, he called it a failure of will, and Mairon listened. This is the hinge of the whole long history, this quiet listening, and we should dwell upon it slowly, for there was no thunderclap, no single black hour in which the servant of light became the servant of shadow. There was only a series of small agreements, each one reasonable, each one flattering to the very best in him, each one drawing him a hand's breadth further from the true. Melkor did not ask Mairon to love cruelty. He asked him to love results. He did not ask him to desire suffering. He asked him to desire order so purely that all which stood in the way of order became by slow degrees a thing that might justly be swept aside. For the love of order can curdle into the love of control as milk curdles in the heat, so gradually that no single moment marks the turning, and yet the end is wholly changed from the beginning. Mairon had always wished to see the marred things of the world set right. Now he began to wish to set them right himself, by his own hand, according to his own design, brooking no delay and suffering no argument. He had always disliked waste. Now he began to reckon the free choices of others, their errors, their wanderings, their slow and stumbling growth as the very greatest waste of all, a waste that a wise and strong hand might simply forbid. He had always loved perfection. Now he began to believe that perfection could be imposed, that it could be commanded into being by a will strong enough to compel obedience, and that mercy toward the imperfect was only weakness, dressed in a kindly name. So it was that Mairon came, at first in secret, into the service of Melkor. He did not renounce Aulë openly, not in the beginning, for that was not his way, and it was never to be his way in all the ages that followed. Deceit was already becoming the very grain of him. He kept his place, he kept his fair seeming, he kept the trust of those who esteemed him, and behind that fair seeming he gave his true allegiance to the dark. He passed to Melkor the knowledge of Aulë's craft, the secrets of the forges, the working of substances, and the shaping of powers, so that the enemy of the world might arm himself with the very skills that had been meant for its adornment. Of all the traitors in the long history of Arda, none was more grievous, for he betrayed not from weakness or fear or sudden temptation, but from the slow and deliberate corruption of his highest gift. There was in that age a fair place called Almarin, an isle set upon a great lake in the midst of Middle-earth, where the Vala dwelt in the light of the two lamps in the first spring of the world, before the coming of the trees, before the waking of the elves. It was a time of green and growing peace, of gentle waters, and of light that fell soft and even upon all the lands, and Mairon in his fair seeming moved among that peace as one of its keepers. Yet his heart was already turned, and when Melkor at last cast down the two lamps and broke the symmetry of the world in fire and ruin, drowning the spring of Arda in violence, Mairon did not stand with the Valar in their grief. He slipped away into the north, into the strongholds of the enemy, and there at last he set aside the pretense that had cloaked him, and stood forth as what he had chosen to become. He became the chief lieutenant of Melkor, the greatest of all his servants, mightier by far than the Balrogs of flame, and more subtle than any beast or fell spirit in the enemy's host. In the deep places of the North Melkor delved his first great fortress, Utumno, a vast and dreadful hold sunk far beneath the roots of the mountains, and there amid its pits and its cold fires Mairon took his place as master of its dark labours. And when in later years Melkor raised a second stronghold nearer to the coasts, the armoury and the western gates of his dominion, the fortress named Angband, the iron prison, it was Mairon whom he set to command it. Mairon, who held its gates, and marshalled its powers, and wrought within its forges the instruments of the long war to come. He was no longer only the Admirable now. The elves, when they came to know him in the bitter years that followed, would call him Gorthor the Cruel and Sauron the Abhorred, and by these names he would be remembered, while the world endured. Yet even in his cruelty he kept the shape of his first nature, and this is the thing we must carry with us as we go forward into the long tale of his wars and his deceits. He did not become a mindless brute, a mere spender of blood. He remained the craftsman, the orderer, the patient, and meticulous mind that could not bear a thing left ragged or a purpose left unfinished. Where Melkor raged and broke and squandered his strength in vast destructions, Sauron built and planned and waited, and in the fullness of ages he would prove the more enduring peril of the two, for he understood, as his master never truly did, that dominion held through cunning and order outlasts dominion seized through mere terror. And so we leave him here, upon the threshold of the great darkness, the bright servant of the smith, now standing lieutenant of the enemy in the iron halls of Angband, his gifts intact, and his allegiance wholly changed. Before him lie the long wars of the first age of the world, the waking of the elves, and the kindling of the wars over the Silmarils, the drowning of realms and the fall of kings, and his own first great trials of arms against the free peoples of Middle-earth. We turn now, softly, toward that dawn of open war, toward the years when the shadow he had chosen would spread at last across the northern lands, and the name of Sauron would begin its long and dreadful passage into the fear of all living things. We turn now softly to the long years of the elder days, when the world was younger and its wounds were newer, and the shadow that would one day be named the Dark Lord wore still the shape of a servant. For in the first age Sauron was not yet the sole master of the darkness. He was its lieutenant, its most trusted craftsman of ruin, the right hand of Morgoth Barglir, the first and mightiest of the fallen. And in that dark court beneath the Iron Mountains, in the deep and smoking vaults of Angband, Sauron held a place, above all others, more feared than the Balrogs, more subtle than the dragons, more patient than any thrall of the north. He was called Gorthor the Cruel in the tongue of the elves who suffered him, and he had many arts. He was a sorcerer of great power, a master of shapes and of phantoms, a lord of illusion who could clothe himself in fair seeming or in terror, as best served his purpose. He governed the breeding of foul things. He was the keeper of the wolves and the werewolves, the herder of shadows, and it was his delight to twist the living into instruments of dread. Where Morgoth ruled by vast and open malice, Sauron ruled by cunning, by the slow corruption of the will, by the whispered lie that hollowed a heart before ever a blade was drawn. In those days there stood upon the river Sirion a fair island, and upon it a mighty watchtower, and it was called Minas Tirith, the Tower of the Guard. It had been raised by Finrod Felagund, the noble elven king of Nargothrond, that it might keep the pass against the servants of the north. But the tower fell in an evil hour, taken by force and by fear, and Sauron came to dwell within its stones. And under his hand the fair tower became a place of horror, and its name was changed, and men called it thereafter Tolin Gauhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. There Sauron gathered his phantoms and his beasts, and the hills about it were haunted, and no living thing passed near without dread, for the very air was thick with watching malice. From that dark seat he sent forth his eyes across the land, and few could pass the Vale of Sirion unmarked. And it was to this shadow that fate led two travellers, bound upon an errand so great and so hopeless that the songs have never ceased to sing of it. For there came into the north a mortal man named Beren, son of Barahir, and with him went Finrod Felagund, king of Nargothrond, who had sworn an oath of aid to Beren's father in a former year, and would not now forsake it, though it led him into the very jaws of the enemy. And with them went 10 faithful companions of Nargothrond. They came disguised, clad in the foul gear of orcs, their fair faces hidden, their bright voices stilled, hoping to pass unseen beneath the shadow of Tolin Gauhoth and go on into the darkness beyond. But Sauron saw them from his tower, and he was not deceived, for the malice in his sight pierced the seeming of their disguise. And he sent out and took them, and brought them bound into his dark hold. Then began a contest that has few equals in all the tales of the elder days, for Sauron did not know at once who these captives were, only that they were not what they seemed, and Felagund, to shield the errand and the names of his company, strove against him. And they strove not with sword nor with fire, but with words, and with power woven into song. Sauron sang a song of wizardry, of piercing and uncovering, of treachery laid bare and secrets torn open, a chant of the unveiling of all hidden things. And against it, Finrod Felagund rose, and sang a song of the withstanding of power, of secrets kept and trust unbroken, of freedom and of escape, of changing shapes and of things eluding the hunter. And the two voices swayed back and forth in the dark, rising and falling, the one seeking to strip and to bind, the other seeking to hold and to conceal. And Felagund sang of Valinor, of the light of the two trees, upon the green hill of Tuna, of the singing of the elves beneath the stars, in the fair land beyond the sea. But into his song crept the sound of grief, for the shadow of the Kinslaying was upon his people. The blood spilled at Alqualonda, the white ships burning, the sorrow of the Noldor in their exile. And upon that shadow Sauron laid his hand. He turned the grief against the singer, and the memory of guilt became a weight, and slowly, terribly, the song of Felagund was overborne. He fell down before the throne of the enemy, and the disguise was stripped away, and their true shapes were laid bare. Then Sauron knew that these were elves, and men of the enemies of Morgoth, though he learned not their names nor their purpose, for they would not tell him, though he pressed them hard. He cast them into a deep pit, dark and silent, and threatened them with a cruel and lingering death unless one should betray the errand. Yet none would speak, and to break their silence Sauron devised a slow torment, for from time to time he loosed a werewolf into the darkness of the pit, and one by one the companions were devoured, and still no word of treachery was spoken. At the last there remained only Beren and Finrod Felagund, and when the wolf came for Beren, then Felagund put forth all his strength, and burst his bonds, and he grappled with the werewolf, and he slew it with his hands and his teeth, though he himself was wounded to the death in that struggle. And there in the dark, having spent his life to save his companion, Finrod Felagund, fairest and best beloved of the house of Finwë, died. So passed a king of the Noldor, in a nameless pit beneath the Isle of Werewolves, and the shadow of Sauron lay heavy upon that place. Yet the errand was not betrayed, and the light was not wholly quenched, and hope, though thin as a thread, endured in the darkness. We turn now, gently, to the coming of one who would not be broken, for while Beren lay in the pit and mourned, there came to the borders of that haunted isle a maiden of surpassing beauty, Luthien Tinuviel, daughter of Thingol, and of Melian the Maya, fairest of all the children of Ilúvatar. She had fled her father's guarded halls to seek her beloved, and with her came the great hound Huan, mightiest of all wolfhounds, a beast of Valinor, to whom it was fated that he should not fall, save by the greatest wolf that should ever walk the world. Sauron heard of their coming, and he was glad, for he knew the fame of Luthien, and he desired to take her and deliver her to Morgoth. So he sent wolves against her upon the bridge of his island. But Huan the hound slew them silently, one by one, as they came. At the last Sauron sent Dragluin, the sire of werewolves, the greatest of all his beasts, and he too fell beneath the fangs of Huan, and fled back dying to his master, and told him that Huan was there. Then Sauron, remembering the doom set upon Huan, that he should die only by the greatest wolf that should ever be, took upon himself the form of the mightiest werewolf that had ever stalked the earth, a thing of monstrous size and terror, and in that shape he sprang upon the bridge to do battle. But so great was the horror of his coming that Luthien swooned, and yet as he passed she cast the shadow of her cloak across his eyes, and a drowsiness came upon him, and Huan leapt. There upon the bridge the hound of Valinor and the shape-shifting sorcerer wrestled, and it was a long and terrible strife. Sauron changed his form, from wolf to serpent, from serpent to his own shape, and back to monster again, seeking by every art to break the grip of the hound. But Huan held him fast and would not let go, and the strength ebbed from the Dark Lord's servant. And Luthien rose and stood over him, and she spoke, and her power was upon him, and she threatened to strip his spirit naked and send it quailing back to Morgoth, there to be held in scorn forever. Then Sauron yielded, beaten, unmasked, his beast form broken beneath the paws of Huan. He surrendered the mastery of the tower to Luthien, and she took the keeping of the isle, and the pale enchantment that bound the stones was thrown down, and the tower was laid bare. From the pits the captives came stumbling into the light, freed at last, and Beren was found alive amid the dead, mourning above the body of the king who had died for him. But Sauron himself did not stay to be judged. In the form of a great vampire, dark-winged and dripping, he fled from that place, and he passed over the trees, and came at last to Taol Nufuin, the forest under nightshade, and there he abode in a new darkness, filling it with horror. So ended his lordship of the Isle of Werewolves, in defeat and in flight, and this was the first great humbling of the servant who would one day be Lord of all Shadows. The long ages turned, and the wars of Beleriand ran their bitter course. There was the ruin of the battle of unnumbered tears, and the fall of hidden Gondolin, and the drowning of Doriath in kinstrife, and the slow grinding down of all the strength of the elves and their allies before the might of Morgoth. And in all those years, the shadow of Sauron worked in the north. Though the songs turned their eyes more often to his master, he was there in the councils of Angband, a maker of ruin, a breeder of horrors, patient and unrelenting, waiting upon the will of the Dark Lord he served. But there came at the last a reckoning, for the plea of the elves and of men was carried at length over the sea by Eärendil the mariner, and the Valar rose from the west in their wrath, and they came upon the shores of Middle-earth in a host terrible and shining. And this was the War of Wrath, the breaking of the world's northern lands, when the powers of Val-Linor cast down the throne of Morgoth. The mountains were riven, the earth was torn, and Beleriand itself, that fair country of 1,000 songs, sank beneath the devouring sea. Angband was broken open to its roots, and its endless dungeons were laid bare, and Morgoth himself was thrust out from the world, bound and cast into the timeless void beyond the walls of night. And in that great overthrow, Sauron looked upon the might of the Valar, and for a while his heart failed him. For his master was gone, chained and exiled forever, and the servants of the light stood victorious upon the ruin of the north. So Sauron came before Eönwë, the herald of the Valar, the mightiest of the Maiar who had led the host of the west, and he sued for pardon. And in that hour, the tales say, his repentance was not wholly feigned, for he was appalled at the downfall of Morgoth, and the fury of the powers, and something in him recoiled, and for a moment he desired truly to turn from the darkness he had served. Yet Eönwë had not the authority to pardon one of his own order, a Maiar who had done such great evil, and he bade Sauron return into the west, over the sea, and there to stand before the judgment of Manwë himself, and receive the sentence of the Valar. And here the ancient pride of Sauron rose again, and undid his brief remorse. For he would not endure that humbling. He could not bear to come home in shame, to be judged and abased before the very powers he had defied, to give up in a single act the greatness he had gathered to himself over the long ages. And so, rather than face the doom of the West, he hid himself and slipped away, and he fled from judgment, and he remained in Middle-earth. And in that choice, made in the shadow of his master's fall, the seed of all the sorrow yet to come was quietly sown. For the will that would not be judged was the will that would not be healed, and the pride that fled from pardon would in time gather to itself a new and patient malice, colder and more subtle than any that had gone before. Morgoth was gone, cast beyond the world, but his greatest servant remained, uncorrected and unbowed, waiting in the wide and wounded lands. The elder days were ended, and the shape of the world was changed, and a new age crept in upon the quiet after the storm. And in the twilight of that dawning age, Sauron laid himself down in secret, and gathered his thoughts, and began slowly to dream again of dominion. We turn now, softly, from the drowned country of the first age toward the long deceit of the second, where the shadow would learn a fairer face than it had ever worn before. We turn now softly to the long years of quiet, to the age after the Dark Lord's first fall, when the seas had swallowed his master, and the towers of the north stood empty, and the will that had animated so much cruelty lay low, gathering itself in shadow. For Sauron did not perish when Morgoth was cast into the void beyond the walls of the world. He had fled the last battle, slipping like smoke through the ruin of Angband, hiding himself in the lightless places of Middle-earth, while the powers withdrew, and the elves rejoiced, and the world lay stunned by its own deliverance. He waited, he watched, and in that waiting, something in him changed, or seemed to change, for he looked upon the wreck of his lord's ambition, upon the drowned pride and the shattered iron, and he judged that open war and naked terror had been a clumsy instrument, a blunt and wasteful thing. He would not rule by fear alone, he told himself. Not yet. Not while there was a subtler road. He would rule by love and by longing and by the slow seduction of good intentions. For this was ever the deepest craft of Sauron, deeper than his sorcery, deeper than his strength. He understood desire. He understood that the peoples of Middle-earth, and the elves above all, did not hunger for darkness, but for order, for beauty, for the healing of hurts and the staying of decay, and he understood that a gift offered with an open hand may bind more surely than any chain. So he set aside for a season the shape of terror. He put on fairness. He clothed himself in a form of surpassing grace, tall and radiant and wise of aspect, a figure of such nobility that few who looked on him could believe that any shadow lay behind those eyes. And in the long quiet of the Second Age, when the elves who lingered in Middle-earth were building anew, he sought them out. He came at length to Eregion, the land the elves called Hollin, that green country beneath the misty mountains where the holly grew and where the greatest of the elven smiths had gathered. For there dwelt the Gwathi Myrdain, the people of the jewel-smiths, the most cunning craftsmen of that later age, and among them their lord Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor himself, inheritor of that restless and burning skill that had wrought the Silmarils in the deeps of time. Eregion was rich in lore and in ambition, close in friendship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm beneath the mountains, and its smiths desired, above all things, to make, to shape, to bend the substance of the world toward wonder. And Sauron, who read hearts as a scholar reads a page, saw in that desire the door through which he might enter. He named himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. He gave himself other names also, Olendil and Artano, the friend of Aulë and the High Smith, titles chosen with care to flatter and to reassure, to whisper that he came in the service of making and of mending, and he offered his knowledge freely. He spoke of the arts of the Vala, of the crafts learned in the West, of powers by which the fading of the world might be held back, and Middle-earth made green and glorious again, a paradise in the east to rival the blessed realm across the sea, to ears that ached with the long loss of Valinor, to spirits that grieved the slow dimming of all fair things. Such words were sweeter than any music. Yet not all were deceived, and this we must hold fast to, for in the darkest tellings there is always a remnant that sees clear. To Lindon, to the High King Gil-galad, Annatar also came, or sent his fair persuasions, and Gil-galad would not receive him. Something in the stranger troubled the king, some note beneath the harmony that rang false, and though he could not name the fault, he trusted the unease more than the gift, and he shut his gates against the Lord of Gifts, and sent him away unwelcomed. And with Gil-galad stood Elrond, and in Imladris the same wariness held, so that in the houses of the Noldor's greatest lords the fair form found no purchase. They did not know that Annatar was Sauron, but they knew that they did not know him, and they would take no gifts from a hand they could not read. But Eorigion was not Lindon, and Celebrimbor was not Gil-galad. The smiths of Hollin welcomed Annatar with open arms and open workshops, and they took him in, as a master takes in a fellow master, glad of his lore, dazzled by his skill, hungry for all that he could teach. For years, for long years of the Second Age, he dwelt among them, and he gave them freely of his knowledge, and they grew mighty in craft beyond any smiths that Middle-earth had known or would know again. There was no coercion in it, no cruelty, no visible shadow. There was only teaching and learning, and the slow deepening of trust between the fair stranger and the people of the jewel smiths. And in that teaching lay the philosophy that would undo them, the great and terrible idea at the heart of all that followed. For Annatar spoke to them of the rings. He set before their minds a vision, subtle and beautiful, and poisoned at its root, that the fading of the world need not be endured, that the passage of time and the wearing away of beauty might be arrested, that with rings of power the wearers might preserve what they loved unchanged, might hold the tide of years at bay, might make of Middle-earth a country where nothing fair need ever wither. To the elves who loved the world, and grieved to watch it change and die a little in every passing season, this was the deepest temptation of all, deeper than dominion, deeper than wealth. It was the promise of a stayed hand, of an unfading leaf, of an autumn that would never come. And so, in trust and in longing, and in the pride of their surpassing craft, they set themselves to the making, not knowing that the very desire to halt the turning of the world was itself the shadow's first and finest work upon their hearts. We come now gently to the forging, to the labour of hand and fire in which so much was won and so much was lost. For in the workshops of Eorigion the smiths took up their tools, and under the guidance of Annatar they wrought rings of power, one after another through the passing years, essaying the craft, learning its deep grammar, growing ever bolder in their art. First they made lesser rings, trials and experiments, rings that were as apprentice pieces before the greater work, and then with Annatar beside them, sharing counsel, lending the strange and potent lore he had brought out of the shadow, they made the rings of power in truth, rings into which was poured great virtue and great craft, rings that could preserve, enhance and conceal, rings that held within their small circles a portion of the maker's own strength and the deeper strength of the arts that Sauron had taught. And Sauron aided in the making of many. His hand was in them, his knowledge, his subtle guidance at the anvil, and in the quenching, so that a part of his own devising lay woven into their substance. This was the seed of the treachery, planted long before it flowered. For Celebrimbor and his people believed that they laboured for the healing of Middle-earth, for the staying of decay and the preservation of beauty, and in their portion of the work they laboured truly and without malice. But their fair instructor laboured toward another end, and he had never once forgotten it beneath all his gifts and all his gentle counsel. For while the smiths wrought in the light of Eorigion, Sauron withdrew, in secret, to his own dark country. Far to the east and south he had built his stronghold in the land of Mordor, the black land ringed with mountains. And there, in the fire of the mountain, the elves would name Orodruin, and men would call Mount Doom. He set himself to a labour that no other hand might share, and no other eye might see. In the heart of that burning mountain, in the deep places where the fire of the world came near the surface, he forged in secret a ring of his own. Into it he poured not craft alone but himself, a great part of his native strength and will and cruelty, all the malice of his ancient spirit, all his desire to dominate and to possess. He made the one to be the master of all the others, the ring that would find them and command them and bend their wearers to his purpose, for he had woven his knowledge into their making, and through that shared substance the one could reach and rule. And as he forged it, he set upon it, and within it a spell, words of power in the black speech of Mordor, words that would echo down all the ages after. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. This was the whole of his design laid bare in a single breath, the domination of every will that had touched the ring-craft, the gathering of all that fair labour into his own clenched hand. He had given gifts freely for years upon years, and now he claimed the price, and the price was mastery over all who had received. But in the moment of his triumph came his first undoing, and here the great craft turned against its maker. For when Sauron set the one upon his finger, and spoke the words of binding, thinking to seize in a single stroke the wills of all who wore the rings of power, the elves perceived him. Across the leagues in the same instant, Celebrimbor and the wise among the Gwaithai Myrdain felt the shadow fall upon their thought, felt the reaching hand, felt the cold intent behind the fair mask they had trusted so long. In one terrible moment of understanding, the veil was torn, and they knew Annatar for what he was, knew the Lord of Gifts to be the Lord of Shadows, knew that all their labour of years had been a snare, laid patiently about their own necks, and in that knowing they took the rings from their fingers and would be commanded no more. Then was the friendship of Eregion ended, and betrayal stood naked where trust had stood. And the elves, though grieved and afraid, were not wholly without recourse, for 3 rings they held apart, 3 that were the greatest and the most nearly untouched by the shadow's hand. The 3, it is told, Celebrimbor had wrought alone, by his own art, without the direct labour of Sauron upon them, though still within the deep tradition Sauron had taught, and so they too were bound to the one, yet they were purer than the rest and freer of malice. These the elves hid, they sent them far from Eregion, into keeping that Sauron might not guess, so that their virtue might endure, and their power be kept clean of him for as long as the one lay lost or hidden. Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, the rings of fire and water and air, passed into shadow and secrecy, to wait through the long ages for a use their makers could not foresee. But the one remained upon the Dark Lord's hand, and his purpose, though thwarted in its first stroke, was not broken, but only kindled the hotter. He had been seen, he had been refused, and a spirit such as his knew but one answer to refusal. We turn now softly from the anvil and the quenching fire toward the years of wrath that followed, toward the marching of armies and the fall of Eregion, toward the long war for the rings, and the shadow lengthening at last across all the western world. We turn now softly to the age when the rings were newly made, when the forges of Eregion had cooled, and the deceiver had slipped his mask, and the light of the elven smiths curdled at last into dread. For long had Sauron dwelt among them under the fair name of Annatar, Lord of Gifts, teaching, guiding, and beguiling, and in that guise he had shared in the making of the great rings, all save the 3. But when in the fires of Orodruin he forged the one, and set it upon his hand, and spoke the words that bound the others to his will, the elves heard him afar in their thought, and they knew him, and they were afraid. Swiftly they drew off their rings, and would not use them, and the long deceit was broken. And Sauron, seeing that he was revealed, and that the elves would not be ruled, was filled with wrath, and he demanded that they render up to him all the rings that his council had wrought. For without his art, he claimed, they never would have made them. They refused him. Then began the war that men would call the War of the Elves and Sauron, a grief that drowned the green lands of Eredor in fire and in ruin. Out of Mordor he gathered his hosts, orc and wolf, and fell things without number, and he loosed them westward like a black tide breaking upon the borders of the fair country. And though the elves were valiant, and Gil-galad watched from the havens in the north, the strength of Sauron in those days was very great, and it was newly wed to the power of the One Ring, and few could stand against him in open field. Foremost among all his desires was a region, the land of the elven smiths, called Hollin by later tongues, for there dwelt Celebrimbor, grandson of Fëanor, the greatest craftsman of the Second Age, and there lay the 9 and the 7 that Sauron so hungered to possess. Upon that green country he fell with the whole weight of his malice. The land was overrun, and its people slain or scattered, and the house of the Myrddin, the jewel smiths, was besieged and broken. Celebrimbor himself, who had repented too late of the friendship he had given to Annatar, made his last stand upon the steps of the Myrddin, and there he was taken. Long and cruel was his questioning, for Sauron sought the hiding of the rings above all else. The 7 Celebrimbor yielded up at the last, under torment beyond the telling. But of the 3 he would say nothing, not their making, not their keeping, not their names, though the deceiver wrung him with every art of pain that he possessed. And so Celebrimbor died, and his body, pierced with arrows, was borne as a banner before the armies of Mordor, a token of terror to break the hearts of those who yet resisted. In such wise fell the last and greatest of the smiths of the Noldor, silent to the end, keeping faith with the 3 that he had hidden away. Now the fury of Sauron rolled on unchecked, and the whole of Eredor lay open before him. The remnant of the elves under Elrond, whom Gil-galad had sent forth with a small host, was driven back and encircled, and could not break the siege that pressed about them, and in that dark hour it seemed that all the west of Middle-earth would be swallowed. Sauron ranged where he willed. His scouts came even to the shores of the western sea, and his shadow lengthened over lands that had known no war in an age. He was, in those years, master of nearly all that lay east of the mountains and west of them alike, and only scattered strongholds held out against the closing dark. Yet the deceiver, in his pride, had counted too little upon the sea, and upon the men who came out of it. For in the west, upon the star-shaped isle that the Valar had raised from the waters, dwelt the Númenorians, the Dunedain, mightiest of mortal men, tall and fair, and long of life, mariners without peer. And Gil-galad, hard-pressed, had sent messengers over the waves to beg the aid of Tar-Minastir, king of Númenor. The king did not turn away his ear. Out of the uttermost west came the great fleet of Númenor, a countless host of white sails upon the grey water, and it fell upon the rear of Sauron's armies, where they lay along the coasts and the river mouths. The Dunedain came ashore in their strength, mailed and terrible, and the tide of the war was turned in a single season. Where the servants of the shadow had ranged unopposed, now they were hemmed and harried and slain. At the river Gwathlo, the grey flood, Sauron's host was utterly broken, and he himself narrowly escaped the ruin, fleeing eastward with a scant guard, his power in the west shattered, and his dominion undone. All the land he had won was wrested from him again, and the survivors of his armies were hunted from Eredor. So Sauron came back at last to Mordor, the land he had chosen and made his own, ringed about with mountains like a fortress raised by the earth itself. There he sat, brooding, nursing his hatred, and he gathered his strength anew, slowly, in the shadow of the mountain of fire, for he had learned that open war upon the elves and the sea kings together was beyond him for a while. He turned instead to the patient labour of corruption and to the tools he had already fashioned. For the 9 rings remained to him, and the 7 he had taken from the smiths of Eregion, and these he began to give away, and gifts of Sauron are chains. The 7 he gave to the lords of the dwarves, and though they were not made thralls by them, for the dwarves proved hardy and would not be bent to shadow, as men were bent, yet the rings woke in them a great and fatal lust for gold, and kindled fires that in the end consumed the treasuries of their kings. But it was the 9 that served him best and most terribly. These he gave to mortal men, to kings and sorcerers and great lords of the world, and they took them gladly, for the rings gave to them wealth beyond measure, and glory and long life that did not end. One by one they rose to power in their several realms, and one by one they fell. For those who use a ring of power do not truly gain life, but only a stretching of their years, a weariness without rest and a slow fading. Little by little they became invisible to mortal eyes, walking in the twilight world that the One had opened to them, and their bodies passed into shadow, while their spirits endured, bound utterly to the will of the Master who held the One. They became the ring-wraiths, the Nazgul, the 9 servants that could not die. Cloaked and hooded, formless and cold, they were the deadliest of all Sauron's slaves, and their coming was announced by a dread that stopped the heart, and their captain was the mightiest sorcerer among them, whom later ages would name the Witch King. So passed the 9 mortal kings into undying bondage, and the shadow in the east had found its most enduring hands. And with the Nazgul about him, and Mordor closing like a fist, Sauron waited and watched the western sea, where the last of his desires had begun to take shape upon the star-shaped isle. We turn now softly to Númenor, the land of gift, and to the long and glittering road by which its glory came at last to ruin. For the Dúnedain, whom the Valar had blessed above all other men, had grown across the slow centuries into a people of surpassing might, and their ships covered the seas, and their harbours and towers rose along the western coasts of Middle-earth. Yet with their greatness there grew also a shadow in their hearts, a fear of death that no wealth could ease, and a bitterness against the ban of the Valar, which forbade them to sail into the uttermost west and seek the deathless lands. And as the fear grew, so grew their pride, and their kings became grasping and stern, and they came to Middle-earth no longer as helpers of the lesser men, but as lords and tyrants, demanding tribute and building fortresses of dominion. In those latter days there arose a king mightier than all, who had gone before him, our Pharazôn the Golden, who seized the sceptre and the throne, and who thirsted above all things for power without end. Word came to him upon the wind that in Middle-earth one had named himself King of Men, and King of all the earth, and this was Sauron, who had rebuilt his strength and set his dominion once more over wide lands. And our Pharazôn, in his pride, would suffer no rival to that title. He gathered a great armament, the mightiest that the world had yet seen, and he sailed east to make war upon the Dark Lord, and the sails of Númenor covered the sea from shore to shore, and the sound of their trumpets was as the roaring of the sea. When that host came to land at Umbar, and the earth shook beneath the marching of the Númenorians, the servants of Sauron fled from him, and his own strength availed him nothing against such splendour. For Sauron was wise, and he saw that here was a power he could not overthrow by arms, and so he set aside his open malice, and he did a thing most cunning, he surrendered. He came forth humbly from his tower, and abased himself before the king, and feigned repentance, and submitted to be taken as a prisoner and borne back across the sea to Númenor. It was a captivity of his own devising, for he knew well that no fortress of his own could match the isle of the Dúnedain, and that once within their walls he might work a ruin more complete than any siege could bring. Our Pharazôn, in his triumph and his folly, took the fair-seeming captive aboard his ships, and carried the deceiver into the very heart of the blessed land, and set him among the councils of the great. Not 3 years passed before the prisoner had become the honoured counsellor, and not many more before the counsellor had become the master of the king's mind in all things. For Sauron was subtle beyond the measure of men, and he wore, still in that age, a form of great beauty, and his voice was wise and soft, and full of promises. He whispered to the fear that gnawed within them. He told them that death was not the gift of the one, but a wound and a robbery, and that beyond the darkness there lay a freedom that the Valar had hidden from them out of jealousy, and that a king so mighty as Ar-Pharazôn need bow to no ban, and accept no limits set upon his life. And the king believed him. So the corruption of Númenor was accomplished from within, gently, patiently, as a canker spreads unseen within a fruit that is still fair upon the branch. Sauron taught them a new worship, and it was not to the one that they raised their prayers, nor to the Valar, but to the dark, to Melkor, the ancient enemy, whom Sauron named the Lord of all and the giver of freedom. Upon the hill, in the midmost of the city, he caused to be built a great temple, mighty and terrible, with a dome of silver and walls of black, and within it a fire was kindled that never went out, and the smoke of its burning rose ever from the summit and stained the clear air of the isle. Upon that altar there were offerings made, and they were not of beasts. The faithful, who yet held to the old reverence and would not bow to the dark, were hunted down and taken, and they were slain upon the altar of Melkor, accused of disloyalty, of hatred of the king, of scheming against the realm, and their blood was spilt that the Númenorians might buy from the darkness a deliverance from death. Yet no deliverance came. The people did not cease to die, but now they died in fear and in madness, and a sullen unhappiness lay upon all the land, and the trees of the gardens withered, and even in their wealth and splendour the Dúnedain found no peace. Still Sauron whispered, and still the king grew older, and the nearer that Ar-Pharazôn drew to the ending of his days, the more fiercely did the fear of death consume him. And Sauron, seeing that the fruit was ripe at last, spoke to him the final counsel, the one to which all the long deceit had been bending. The undying lands lay in the west, he said, and there dwelt the deathless, and only there might life without end be seized. The Valar held them by no right, but by fear of the strength of men. Let the king but assemble a force great enough, and sail against the west, and wrest immortality from the deathless by the might of his own hand. So Ar-Pharazôn, aged and blinded by dread, gave the command, and there began the building of the great armament, the mightiest fleet that ever sailed the seas of the world. For years the forests of the isle were felled, and its harbours laboured without rest, and ships past counting were raised, and arms and engines of war beyond all reckoning, until the whole strength of Númenor stood ready upon the water, poised to break the oldest law that had been set upon the children of Ilúvatar. And the sky darkened, and a great eagle-shaped cloud came out of the west as a warning, and thunder rolled upon the mountain, yet the king would not turn back. We turn now softly toward the breaking of the world and the fall of Númenor into the deep. We turn now softly to the island that stood at the centre of the world, the great gift of the Valar to the men who had endured, the land raised from the sea in reward for the faithful who had fought beside the elves against the first Dark Lord. Númenor it was called, the Westerness, the star of the ocean, set midway between Middle-earth and the shores of the undying lands. There the Adon dwelt in long life and long wisdom, their kings crowned beneath the white tree, their ships white-winged upon the grey waters, their years stretching far beyond the measure of lesser men. For 3,000 years they flourished, and their glory was a light upon the sea, and they asked for nothing that was not granted, save the one thing forbidden them. They could not sail west, they could not set foot upon the deathless shore. This was the ban of the Valar, laid gently and laid firmly. that men should not seek the land where they could not stay, for death was the gift given to men, and no crossing of water could unmake it. And for many ages the Númenóreans accepted this, and honoured it, and looked west only with longing, and not with envy. But longing, held too long and fed too richly, curdles at last into resentment, and the shadow that fell upon Númenor came not from without, but from within, slowly, quietly, in the hearts of kings who had begun to hate the ending of their days. Now Sauron in Middle-earth had grown mighty again, and he had taken to himself the title King of Men, and he mocked the pretensions of the Sea Kings, who claimed lordship over the western world. And when Ar-Pharazôn, the last and proudest of the kings of Númenor, brought his fleet to the shores of Middle-earth in a display of overwhelming power, Sauron did a thing that was subtle beyond the strength of armies. He did not fight. He knelt. He surrendered himself and let himself be taken as a hostage to Númenor, and carried across the sea into the very heart of the island he meant to destroy. For he had learned in his long climbing that a fortress is most easily taken from the inside, and that a proud heart is a door left open. He came in chains, and within a few short years he stood at the right hand of the king, his chief counsellor, the whisperer behind the throne. His fair form served him yet, and his voice was honey and iron, and he told the Númenóreans what they most wished to hear, that death was not a gift, but a theft, that the Valar had lied to them, that the true Lord of all was the giver of freedom, the darkness that was before the world, whom he named Melkor, his old master, the first and greatest of the fallen. And he raised a temple, a great dome of silver crowned with a fire that never ceased, and there he taught them to burn offerings, and the smoke of their burnings hung over the land like a shroud. So the light of Númenor was quenched from within, and the white tree was cut down and given to the fires, and the faithful few who still honoured the old ways were hunted and offered upon the altar, and the island that had been the fairest work of men became a place of fear and cruelty and slow rot beneath its golden surface. And Sauron, watching, waited, for he had one last lie to tell, and it was the greatest of all, and it would destroy them utterly. He told Ar-Pharazôn that the Valar kept the deathless land for themselves alone, that immortality lay upon those shores like fruit upon the ground, and that a king mighty enough to seize it need not die at all. And the old king, withered now and terrified of the dark, believed him. He built the greatest armament the world had yet seen, a fleet beyond counting, and he armed it, and he set sail into the forbidden west to make war upon the powers themselves, and wrest deathlessness from their hands. Then the Valar laid down their governance, for this was beyond them, this assault of men upon the sacred shore. They called upon the One, upon Ilúvatar, the maker of all things, and the world was changed. The seas rose up. A great chasm opened in the ocean, and the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn was swallowed, and the king himself, who set foot at last upon the deathless land, was buried beneath falling hills, there to lie until the end of days. And then the wave came for Númenor itself. The sea climbed over the island, over its towers and its temple and its fields, over the mountain at its heart, and the star of the west was drowned in a single terrible hour, and its people perished, and its glory passed out of the circles of the world forever. Akallabeth, the downfallen, the survivors named it, and they wept for it across all the years that followed. The very shape of the earth was remade in that hour. Before, the world had been flat, and a mortal ship sailing far enough west might have come at last to the shores of Valinor. But now the deathless lands were taken away, removed from the spheres of the earth, and the world was bent into a globe, so that all roads led round and back again, and no mortal keel could ever again find the straight way into the west. Only the elves kept that road, and only their grey ships passing out of sight of mortal eyes. And Sauron was in Númenor when the wave came. He had stood in his temple, laughing, certain that the destruction would fall upon the deluded men, and pass him by, for he was a spirit and could not truly die, and in this he was half right and half undone. The drowning of the island destroyed his body, the fair and beautiful form he had worn since the shaping of the rings, the shape with which he had deceived kings and elven smiths alike. That form was lost in the ruin, and it was lost forever, for something was broken in him that could not be mended. Never again could he wear a face that seemed fair. Never again could he walk among the peoples of the earth as a comely stranger with kind eyes and a gentle voice. The mask was torn away in the sea, and beneath it there was only the ancient malice, and from that hour he could clothe himself only in forms of terror and dominion, dark and dreadful, a shape to be feared and never loved. His spirit, robbed of its beauty, fled across the changed and reeling sea, back over the drowned miles to Middle-earth, back to the black land that was his own. It bore with it the one thing he had kept about him through everything, through the deceit and the temple and the fires and the flood. The ring. The ruling ring came back to Mordor upon a homeless spirit, and there in the tower he had raised, Barad-dûr, Sauron took shape again in darkness, and he set the ring once more upon a hand that now was only shadow and will, and the eye that would haunt the last age of the world opened at last upon Middle-earth. We turn now, gently, to the shores where the exiles landed, and to the last time that men and elves stood together against the shadow, sword to sword, upon the plains before the Black Gate. For not all the Númenorians had followed their king into ruin. There were among them the faithful, those who had kept the old friendship with the elves and the old reverence for the Valar, and their leader was Elendil the Tall, and his sons were Isildur and Anarion. When the shadow was thickest upon the island, they had held their ships ready, laden with their households and their treasures, and the 7 seeing stones and a seedling of the white tree, and when the wave rose, they were borne up upon it and cast, storm-driven and grieving, upon the western shores of Middle-earth. There, out of the wreck of the drowned kingdom, they founded the realms in exile, Arnor in the north, and Gondor in the south, and they built white cities and raised towers of watchfulness, and they set the seeing stones in high places, and they planted the seedling of the tree in the court of the kings. But they had come, without knowing it, into the very shadow of their enemy, for Sauron had returned to Mordor in the same years, and he watched the growth of these southern kingdoms with a hatred sharpened by memory, for these were the sons of the island that had drowned his fair form and cast him homeless upon the sea. And when he judged himself strong enough, he struck. He took the city of Minas Ithil, and he defiled it, and the white tree that grew there was burned. The war he began was long, and it was bitter, and it seemed for a time that the young realms would be swept away as Númenor had been swept. Then Elendil sought out the one power in Middle-earth that could stand with him, and that was Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor in the west, in whose keeping was Vilya, the mightiest of the 3 elven rings. And these two, the Elf King and the Sea King, made a bond that the songs would remember to the ending of the world. The last alliance of elves and men, it was named, for never again after it would the 2 kindreds march together in such numbers and such purpose. Their host was very great, gathered out of Lindon and Rivendell, and the exiled realms, spears beyond counting, banners of silver and of stars, and they marched east through the passes, and came down at last into the plain before Mordor. Upon the field of Dagorlad, the battle plain, the great clash came, and it was terrible, and the marshes there would hold the faces of the fallen for ages after, so that men and elves and orcs seemed to sleep together beneath the still water, and no living thing should look too long upon them. The alliance broke the front of Sauron's armies and drove them back, and passed within the ring of the mountains of shadow, and came before the tower itself, Barad-dûr, the dark tower, raised upon the strength of the rings that it could not be thrown down, while the ring endured. And so began the siege, and it lasted 7 years. 7 years the host of the Alliance sat before the Black Tower, and there was no swift ending, for the will of Sauron was in the very stones, and his fire came out against the besiegers, and many great ones fell. And Narion, son of Elendil, was slain there by a stone cast down from the walls. The years ground on, grief upon grief, and still the eye watched from the height, and still the tower stood. Then at the last, when the siege had worn both sides to the bone, Sauron himself came forth. He came down from his tower in his own dreadful person, in the terrible form that was all that remained to him, and he strode into the battle, and none could stand against him. Gil-galad and Elendil, the 2 kings, the elf and the man, went up against him together, for only the mightiest could hope to endure his presence at all. And in that combat, both of them were destroyed. Gil-galad was consumed by the heat of Sauron's hand, and the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth passed from the world. Elendil the Tall fell also, and his sword Narsil broke beneath him as he fell, shattered into pieces upon the stones. But Sauron in that moment was not untouched, for the effort of slaying 2 such lords had spent something in him, and he faltered. And Isildur, the son of Elendil, standing above the body of his father, took up the hilt shard of the broken sword, the jagged remnant of Narsil, and with that broken blade he struck at the hand of the Dark Lord, and cut from it the finger upon which the ruling ring was set. And in that instant the will that upheld the tower and the armies and the whole long war was severed. Sauron's form was overthrown, his spirit dispelled, driven out and unhoused, fleeing shapeless and diminished into the wild places, and his body was gone. The tower's power was broken, the siege was ended. The shadow for a time was lifted from the world, and there upon the slopes of the mountain came the moment that would shape all the ages after, and undo, in time, everything that had been won. For Isildur held the ring in his hand, cut warm from the enemy's own body, and Elrond and Círdan, who stood beside him, counselled him to cast it then into the fire of Orodruin, the mountain in whose heart it had been forged. For only there could it be unmade, and only its unmaking could end the threat of Sauron forever. But Isildur would not. He looked upon the ring, gold and gleaming and beautiful, and he said that he would keep it, as weregild for his father and his brother, as recompense for all that the war had cost his house. He did not know, or would not let himself know, that it was keeping him even as he claimed to keep it, that the will bound into it had already turned his grief into greed, and his loss into longing, so the one chance passed quietly on a mountainside, with the smoke still rising, and the dead still warm. The ring was not destroyed, it went with Isildur down out of the mountains, and the shadow was only scattered, not slain, only sleeping, not gone. And Sauron, unbodied and defeated, faded into the dark and the empty lands, a hunted spirit with neither form, nor tower, nor army, seeming for all the world to have perished utterly. The kingdoms of men breathed again. The elves believed the evil ended. The songs were sung, and the years turned, and the memory of the war grew faint and golden with the telling. But the ring endured, and while it endured, its master could not truly die, and somewhere in the shadows, beyond the knowledge of the wise, the will that had drowned an island and outlasted a siege gathered itself, patiently, in silence, and waited. We turn now, softly, into that long quiet, the slow centuries of the Third Age, when the world forgot to be afraid, and the small gold thing passed out of memory into rumour, and out of rumour into legend, and waited in the dark for the hand that would carry it home. We turn now softly to the years of quiet, to the long, slow ebb of years in which the world believed the shadow undone. For the ring had passed from the hand of Isildur in the cold waters of the Gladden fields, and the spirit of Sauron, unclothed and unhoused, drifted formless upon the winds of Middle-earth, like smoke without a fire to father it. He was not slain, for such a being as he could not be slain by the falling of a body, yet he was unmade of all that gave him seeming and mastery, diminished, scattered, and near to nothing, a hate without hands, a will without a voice. And so began the age that later lawmasters named the watchful peace, though it was less a peace than a held breath, a stillness beneath which the old malice gathered itself again, patient as stone, in secret and in shadow. For a long age he was little more than a formless dread, a thin malice creeping unseen through the wild lands east of the misty mountains, and the memory of him faded from the speech of men, who are quick to forget, and who name a thing ended when its terror grows dim. The kingdoms of the Dunedain in the north waned and were divided, and Gondor in the south held its long slow watch upon the eastern marches, and the great enemy was thought no more than a tale for the fireside, a peril of the elder days. Yet even so, in the empty countries, the shape of him was reforming, slowly, as water finds again its level, drawing to itself the old bonds of dominion, the old craft of fear, the old long labour of malice that had never truly ceased to be. And there came a time, some 1,000 years and more after the fall of Isildur, when a shadow fell upon the great forest that men then called Greenwood the Great, a wide and living wood of eaves and glades and ancient beeches, wherein the woodland elves kept their halls in gladness. Southward in that forest there stood a hill, and upon the hill an old fastness of stone, and into that dark hold there crept a nameless fear, a dweller in the deep places, and slowly the trees about it grew close and tangled and unwholesome, and the light beneath the boughs grew dim, and spiders black and monstrous spun their webs across the paths, and the very air grew heavy with a watchful malice. Men named that hold Dol Guldur the Hill of Sorcery, and they named its master only the Necromancer, for none guessed in those first years, whose spirit had returned to clothe itself again in dread. And the fair wood took a new and darker name, and was called Mirkwood thereafter, and the shadow lay long upon it. Now the wise were troubled, for the wise perceived the turning of the shadow before the world at large will heed it, and among them was Mithran Deer, the grey pilgrim, whom men called Gandalf, who walked the wide lands unresting and marked the small signs that lesser watchers let pass. He looked long upon the darkening of the wood, and upon the growing dread of Dol Guldur, and a doubt awoke in him that would not be stilled, a cold surmise that the necromancer was no petty sorcerer, nor lingering wraith, but something far older and far worse, a malice that the world had believed forever broken. And so it was that Gandalf resolved to look upon the matter with his own sight, and he passed in secret into the pit of Dol Guldur, cloaked and unseen, treading the dark stairs beneath the hill, and there he found more than he had feared. For in that darkness he sensed the presence of a great and ancient will coiled and watchful, gathering its strength, and though it fled from him and hid itself, and would not be plainly known, he came away with a dread settled deep within him, a near certainty that the old enemy was returning, that Sauron himself or the shadow of him had taken root once more in the living world. Yet he had no proof that others would heed, and the counsels of the wise were slow, and the years were long, and the shadow was patient beyond the patience of any watcher. There was formed in those years a council of the mighty that men have named the White Council, wherein were gathered the chief among the wise and the elven lords of long memory, the Lady of the Golden Wood, and the Lord of Rivendell, keeper of the ancient law, and the wizards of the order, foremost among them the White, Curanir, whom men called Saruman, greatest in craft, and in seeming of them all. And they took counsel together concerning the darkness in the wood, and the fear that grew in Dol Guldur, and Gandalf urged upon them a swift assault, that the evil be driven out before it should wax too strong to be moved. But Saruman, who was the head of the council, counselled delay, and spoke soft words of patience, and said that the necromancer was no more than a lingering fear that would pass, or that could not yet be safely struck, and by his counsel the council held its hand. And in this delay there was a hidden purpose, though few then perceived it, for Saruman had begun already the long turning of his own heart, and had set his thought upon the one ring that was lost, desiring in secret to find it for himself. He knew, better than he let be known, that the ring, if it endured in the world, would seek its master, and that its master, if he waxed in strength, would draw it home again down the years. And Saruman reasoned that were the necromancer left to grow, and to search and to labour, then the ring might be stirred from its long hiding and reveal itself, and might be taken then by a hand swifter and subtler than Sauron's own. So under the cloak of caution he stayed the council's hand, and the shadow in the wood was suffered to endure, and to deepen, and to spread its slow dominion over the years, while the wise watched and debated, and did not strike. And thus the long silence held, uneasy and unbroken, while beneath the darkened boughs of Mirkwood the old enemy grew ever nearer to the fullness of his ancient self. We turn now, gently, to the breaking of that silence, and to the hour when the wise at last bestirred themselves and struck at the darkness in the wood. For the years had passed and the shadow had grown bold, and the signs of its waxing could no longer be gainsaid, and Gandalf pressed the council once more, and this time even Saruman gave way, for reasons of his own that ran deeper than his fellows knew. And so the White Council put forth its strength against Dol Guldur, and the powers of the wise were bent upon the hill of sorcery, and the necromancer was assailed in his fastness and driven forth, and the dark hold was thrown down and emptied, and for a little while it seemed to men that a great evil had been undone. Yet it was not so, for Sauron had long foreseen this hour, and he had prepared for it, and his flight was no rout but a chosen going, a feint devised with cunning. He suffered himself to be cast out of Mirkwood, giving up a hold that had served its purpose, that the wise might believe their work accomplished and turn their watch elsewhere, while he passed away in secret to the land that had been his of old, to the black country beyond the mountains that he had ruled in the elder days. For long ere the council struck, he had made ready that dark refuge again, and his servants had laboured in secret to raise anew the walls and the towers of his ancient seat, and thither he went, openly at last, casting off the guise of the necromancer, as a worn cloak no longer needed. So Sauron returned to Mordor, the black land, girt about with its wall of ashen mountains, and he came again into the plain of Gorgoroth, and to the place where his great tower had stood, and there he set his will to the raising of Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, upon its old and cursed foundations, for that fortress had been reared in the deeps of time with the power of the ring wrought into its very stones, and though it had been cast down at the ending of the Second Age, it had never been wholly unmade, for while the ring endured in the world, its foundations could not utterly perish. And so upon the old roots the tower rose again, black and terrible, tier upon tier of iron and sorcery, crowned at its summit with the chamber, whence the eye would keep its sleepless watch, and Mordor woke once more to the tread of its master. And now the enemy cast aside all concealment, and declared himself openly, and the shadow that had crept so long in secret stood forth unveiled in the sight of the free peoples, and dread ran out from Mordor across the lands. He gathered to his standard the orcs that bred in the dark places of the mountains, multiplying them beyond count in the pits and the caverns, and he summoned the cruel men of the east and of the south, the Easterlings and the Haradrim, who had served his shadow of old and served it yet, and he armed them and marshalled them into the hosts that would in time march to war. And the Nazgûl, the Nine, his most dread servants, who had waited bodiless and bound through all the long years, came forth again at his call to do his bidding, wraiths robed in fear, and one among them he set as captain over Minas Morgul, the tower of sorcery in the western marches, hard by the passes into Gondor. Yet above all his labours, above the breeding of armies and the raising of towers, there was set one desire that ruled the Dark Lord's every thought, and that was the recovery of the One Ring, the Master Ring wherein he had poured so great a part of his own being in the elder days. For he knew that without it he could never come to the fullness of his former might, that clothed as he was, he remained the lesser image of what he once had been, and he knew also, with a cold and gnawing fear, that were the ring to be found by another, and mastered, then he himself might be cast down and unmade forever. And so he set spies and searchers upon the wide world, questing after any rumour of the thing that had been lost so long ago in the waters of Anduin, and he strained his thoughts upon the river and the vale where Isildur had perished, seeking any thread that might lead him to his own. And in this searching there came into his hands a creature small and wretched and ruined, a thing that had once been near to the kindred of the river folk, withered now, by long ages in the dark and by the long keeping of a treasure it had loved and lost. For this creature, that named itself Gollum by the sound in its own throat, had borne the ring in secret beneath the mountains for ages beyond the count of its own kind, until the ring forsook it and passed to another hand, and it had crept forth at last into the wide world, gnawed by longing, hunting for that which it had lost. And in its wanderings it was taken by the servants of Mordor and brought before the Dark Lord, and it was cast into the pits of torment, and it was questioned in fire and in anguish. And Gollum, who had no strength to withstand such torment, at the last gave up the two words that Sauron most desired, two names wrung from its broken whispering, Baggins and the Shire. For the creature had learned in the days of its own grief, whose hand had come by the ring, and it had traced the theft to a name and a country, and now, under torment, it yielded them up. Baggins, said the creature, and Shire, and these were words that Sauron had never heard, strange names of a small and hidden people, of whom he knew nothing, yet he grasped that here at last was the thread he had sought so long, the trail that led toward the ring, and he loosed the creature, thinking that its own hunger might yet serve his purpose, and he turned the whole weight of his dark thought toward the finding of that name and that land, and sent forth his most terrible servants to hunt for it. And so the nine went out from Mordor, mounted upon black steeds, robed in the shape of dread, and passed westward over the land, seeking a country called the Shire, and a small person named Baggins, and the world drew near to the hour of its great trial. For the ring that had lain hidden and forgotten was hidden no longer, and the hand that held it was known, and all the long patience of the shadow was gathered now to a single point of purpose, and the storm that had been so long in building stood upon the edge of breaking. Thus stands the world at the ending of the long years of the enemy's return. The dark tower risen again in Mordor, the armies gathering in the ash-grey plains, the nine riding forth into the west, and the small hidden folk of the Shire, all unknowing that the greatest peril of the age draws near to their quiet doors. And we come now softly to the last and the greatest struggle of the Third Age, to the tale of how the ring was carried at last toward the fire that alone could unmake it, and how the free peoples of the world stood against the whole strength of the shadow, in the days that men would remember ever after as the War of the Ring. We turn now softly to the north, and to the long, slow breaking that the Dark Lord set in motion, while he himself stayed hidden. For while the shadow gathered in the wood of greenwood, in the fastness men would later name Dol Guldur, and while the necromancer wore the mask of a nameless sorcerer, the enemy did not sleep, and did not wait idly, and did not spend his patience without purpose. He had lost his body once in the drowning of Númenor, and lost his ring once on the slopes of Orodruin, and lost his shape of fairness forever, and so in this age he learned a quieter craft. He would not march in his own person. He would move his hand through servants, through instruments, through those he had bound to himself long ago with rings of gold. And chief among these, the greatest of the nine, the tallest of the shadows, was the one the North would come to call the Witch King of Angmar. He had been a king of men once, in the deeps of the Second Age, though his name is lost, and his face is lost, and even his kingdom is a rumour now. He had taken a ring and worn it and been devoured by it slowly, until nothing was left but a will and a hunger and a shape of cold. And when Sauron stirred again in the north of Middle-earth, in the years after the fall of the last alliance faded from memory, he sent this greatest of his wraiths ahead of him, north and east, to a bleak land under the shadow of the misty mountains, to a country of grey hills and cold water, and there to build a realm whose only purpose was ruin. The realm was called Angmar, and its dark tower was Carn Dûm, and it rose in the far north where few living things went willingly. And the purpose of Angmar was not conquest for its own sake, and not wealth, and not glory. Its purpose was the undoing of one thing, and one thing only. For to the south and west lay the remnants of a kingdom the enemy feared, the northern kingdom of the Dúnedain, the men of long life and long memory, who had come out of the sea when Númenor drowned. That kingdom was Aulë, and once it had been mighty, a single crown from the Weather Hills to the Blue Mountains, from the Brandywine to the wild lands beyond. But greatness when it is not tended thins, and the line of kings had faltered and quarrelled, and at last had broken. For in the days after Eärendil, the 10th king of Arnor, 3 sons contended for the rule, and the one realm was divided into 3, and never again made whole. In the west and north lay Arthedain, keeping the old capital and the old Palantiri, and the old blood most nearly pure. In the south, between the Brandywine and the Grey Flood, lay Cardolan, a land of downs and barrows, and quiet green country. And in the angle between the 2 rivers, in the wild eastern hills toward the mountains, lay Rudar, the least and the loneliest, where the pure Dúnedain grew few, and where hillmen and lesser folk crept in, and where at last the shadow found its easiest door. This was the wound that Angmar was made to widen. A kingdom already split into 3 is a kingdom that will not stand together, and the Witch King knew it, and he waited upon it, and he worked upon it with the patience his master had taught him. So the long wars began, and they were not swift, and they were not a single storm. They came in seasons over lifetimes, over the reigns of many kings, whose names now sleep in the old rolls. Angmar pressed first upon Rudar, the weakest, and drew it slowly out of the light, until an evil lord of the hillmen, secretly in league with the Witch King, ruled there, and the Dúnedain of that land were slain or driven out, and Rudar became a country of the enemy in all but name. And with Rudar fallen, the shadow had a spear pointed at the heart of the north. The armies of Carn Dûm came down through the hills, and Cardolan and Arthedain stood together when they could, and stood apart when they could not, and bled either way. There were years when the Dúnedain held the line upon the Weather Hills, and years when they lost it. There was the great watchtower of a Monsul Weathertop, where one of the seeing stones was kept, the northern Palantir, and there the men of Arthedain and Cardolan and Rudar had once looked into it together in better days. But the tower was besieged, and the tower was broken, and the last of that stone was carried away west in flight, and the high place where kings had watched became a bare and burned hilltop, a stump of stone against the grey sky. Slowly, over these long grievous years, Cardolan was worn down, its lords falling one by one, its green downs emptied, until at last the old royal house of that land failed utterly, and there was no one left to hold it. And then into the north, as into all the world, came the great plague. It came up out of the east and the south in the darkening years, a sickness that spared neither the great nor the small, and it swept over Gondor in the south, and killed a king, and emptied whole cities, and it did not stop at any border, and it came at last to the Northlands also. And in the north, already thinned by war, already bled by Angmar, the plague fell like a second winter upon a land that had not survived the first. Many of the Dúnedain of the north perished, and in Cardolan the last of the people died in the plague or fled, and the land was left empty, its villages silent, its downs given over to grass and wind, and the long green mounds of the dead. Those mounds are called the Barrow Downs, and in the old tongue, Tían Gorthad, and they were older even than the kingdom, raised in the first days by the fathers of men, before ever the Dúnedain came over the sea, and honoured still as the resting places of the lords of Cardolan. And here the Witch King worked one of his coldest cruelties, for into those hollow hills, into the quiet chambers of the honoured dead, he sent evil spirits out of Angmar and Rudar, wights of shadow and malice, to dwell in the barrows, and to trouble the bones of the kings. And so the last dignity of Cardolan was taken from it. The graves of its lords became a place of dread, where the barrow-wights sang their cold, slow songs, and reached with grey hands, and gathered gold and blades about them in the dark, keeping a vigil that was the opposite of peace, and the green downs, that should have been only sad, became also fearful, and travellers learned to pass them by, and not to sleep among the stones. Now only Arthedain remained, the last kingdom of the north, holding to the old blood and the old ways, and its kings knew what stood against them, and they did not yield easily. There came at last a king named Arvedui, which means last king, and the name was a prophecy, though he did not know it when it was given. In his day the strength of Arthedain was nearly spent, and the strength of Angmar was gathered for the final blow. The armies of Carndum came down in full, and the men of Arthedain could not hold them, and the land was overrun, and Fornost, the last great city of the northern Dúnedain, was taken. And Arvedui fled, north and north again, into the frozen bays of the uttermost cold, and there he was lost, drowned in the ice-choked sea, when a ship of the far northern folk was crushed by the winter. And with him were lost the last two Palantiri of the north, sunk beneath the cold water, never again to be looked into by living eyes. So ended the line of the kings of Arna as reigning kings. The north was fallen. The Witch King sat for a season lord of a ruined country, and it seemed that the work his master had sent him to do was done. But it was not quite done, and the reckoning had begun to turn. For word had gone south, over the long leagues, to Gondor, the enduring southern kingdom of the Dúnedain, and there a fleet was made ready, and an army was gathered, and it came north over the sea, too late to save the north, but not too late to avenge it. It was led by a captain named Eärnur, son of the king of Gondor, bold and proud, and with him rode the strength of the south. And out of Rivendell and the havens came the elves also, and among them one whose name is a light in the dark years, Glorfindel, mighty and shining, who had died once in the fall of Gondolin, an age of the world before, and had come back over the sea and feared no shadow. Upon the field before the ruins of Fornost, the host of Angmar was broken utterly. The Witch King's power in the north was shattered in a single day, and his kingdom of Carndum was thrown down, and Angmar as a realm was ended forever. And in that hour the Witch King came himself upon the field, and Eärnur would have ridden against him, hot with victory, but his horse would not bear him near that cold, and bolted in terror, and the wraith laughed and fled away, and Glorfindel upon his white horse pursued, but the shadow could not be caught, and passed away east into the gathering dark. And Eärnur burned to follow, but Glorfindel held him back, and spoke words that the years would remember. "Do not pursue him," he said. "He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall." And the words were set down and carried forward, a small quiet seed of prophecy planted in the ruin of the north, to wait for its long harvest. So the Witch King withdrew, and did not go idly, and did not go far in spirit, for he went where his master's will now bent. The necromancer's shadow in the south was deepening, and Mordor, long empty and watched, was stirring again behind its black gates. And there, in the years that followed, the greatest of the nine came home to the land of shadow, and gathered the others of his kind about him. The nine riders reunited under the mountains of ash, and prepared the next slow stroke, and that stroke fell upon Gondor's own border. Long the nine lay hidden and waited, and then they came forth in strength, and laid siege to the fair tower of the moon, Minas Ithil, that stood in the pass at the edge of Mordor, keeping watch upon the enemy's land. The city was taken, and its palantir seized, and its light put out. And the tower, that had been called the Tower of the Rising Moon, was made over into a thing of terror, and men gave it a new name, Minas Morgul, the Tower of Dark Sorcery, and its stones glowed thereafter with a corpse-pale light, and no clean thing dwelt there again. And from Minas Morgul the Witch King reigned as Sauron's chief lieutenant in the west, close upon the throat of Gondor across the Vale. And that same darkness reached in time to the ending of the southern line as well. For the young King Ernur, who had ridden north in his pride, came at last to his own crown in Gondor, and never forgot the shame of the horse that would not carry him against the wraith. And the Witch King, who forgot nothing, sent him a challenge out of Minas Morgul once and then again, mocking his old fear. And Ernur, being proud and being childless, and being unwise, rode down at the last with a small company to answer it, and passed within the gates of the dead city, and was never seen again, and how he ended no tale tells. So the line of the ruling kings of Gondor failed also, in the north long before, and now in the south, and the stewards took up the rule, and kept the empty throne, waiting for a king who would not come for near 1,000 years. And in all of this, mark how little the Dark Lord himself was seen. He did not lift a sword in the north. He did not stand upon the field at Fornost. He did not sit in the Tower of the Moon when its light was quenched. He worked through his greatest servant, and through plague and division, and the long patience of shadow, and he stayed hidden in the wood in the south, gathering, listening, growing slowly toward the day he could stand forth again, unmasked. We leave the north now, quiet under its grass and its barrows, and turn our thoughts softly back toward that hidden power, still gathering in the dark of the forest, biding its time, and waiting to be named at last for what it was. And so, having declared his return, having named again the land that would be his seat, having gathered the shadow back into the shape of a fortress, Sauron did not stay his gaze only upon the west, upon the kingdoms of men that faced him, across the mountains and the marshes. We turn now, softly, to the wider country of his will, to the lands that lay beyond the edges of every map the free peoples ever drew, to the east and the south, where his dominion was older and quieter, and in many ways more complete than anything he ever held in the west. For Mordor was only the visible heart of a body that stretched far into lands whose names the histories of Gondor barely knew. Beyond the inland sea of Rhûn, beyond the great river mouths of the south, beyond the deserts and the red hills and the long grasslands, there lived whole peoples, ancient and numerous, who had never seen an elf, who had never heard the name of the Valar spoken kindly, who knew of the West only as a rumour of enemies. And to these peoples, over long ages, Sauron came not as a red eye upon a tower, but as a giver of gifts, a teacher of crafts, a lord who asked for tribute and offered protection, and at the last, a god. The Easterlings were the first and the many. They were not one people, but 100, a shifting confederation of tribes and kingdoms that rose and warred and fell across the vast eastern lands, through all the long years of the sun. Some the annals of Gondor learned to fear by name. There were the Wain Riders, who came in the days of the North Kingdom's decline, a fierce and warlike folk who fought from great wains and wagons, who made their camps into moving cities, who rolled westward in tides that broke upon Gondor's eastern provinces and drowned them. Kings of Gondor fell in battle against the Wain Riders. Provinces were lost, and won again, and lost, and the strength of the South Kingdom was bled slowly across generations by a foe that seemed to have no source and no end. And behind the Wain Riders, unseen, was the whisper of the East, the old council that had first taught them to hate the men of the West. For Sauron did not need to lead these armies. He needed only to plant the thought, the grievance, the promise, and then to wait, and the peoples of the east would do the marching for him, believing all the while that the war was their own. To the south of the Wain Riders' lands lay Khand, a hard country of horse lords and warriors, and there dwelt the Variags, whom the songs of the west remembered chiefly as names in the roll of the enemy at the last great battle before the Black Gate. The Variags of Khand were a proud people, mercenary and fierce, bound to Mordor by ancient treaties and by tribute, and by the simple weight of proximity. For a small nation that lives beside a great shadow learns quickly that it is safer to march under that shadow than to stand against it. So Khand sent its riders when the summons came, and asked few questions, and took its pay in land and plunder, and in the promise that the storm would fall elsewhere. And further south still, beyond the wide brown river and the passes of the Ephel Duath, lay Harad, the Sunlands, the vast and ancient south. Near Harad and far Harad, the histories called it, though to the Haradrim themselves it was simply the world, the whole and sufficient country of men beneath a hotter sun. The Haradrim were dark and tall and many, a people of walled cities and desert caravans, and great war hosts, and among them came the war beasts, that the men of the west had almost forgotten how to fear. The Oliphants, the Mumakil, mountains of grey flesh and ivory, that carried towers upon their backs, and shook the earth when they charged. The Oliphant lords of the south were princes in their own right, and yet they too, in the end, bent toward Mordor, drawn by the same slow gravity that drew all the lands of the east and south into the orbit of the dark. How did he rule them? Not, for the most part, by presence. Sauron seldom rode among these peoples, seldom showed them the shape he wore. He ruled them instead through fear and through tribute, and through the oldest and most terrible of his crafts, which was the making of false gods. For Sauron had learned long ago, in the days of Númenor's fall, how easily the hearts of men could be turned toward the worship of a lie. He had stood in the temple he built upon that drowned island, and taught a king to burn men in sacrifice to the dark, and he had seen how sweet that poison was, how readily men would give their fear a face and call it holy. So in the east and the south he did again, in smaller temples and darker groves, what he had done upon Númenor. He let the peoples there believe that the power behind their kings, the shadow that answered their sacrifices, the voice that promised them victory and reign and vengeance, was a God worthy of their worship. And they gave him that worship, generation upon generation, not knowing that the God they served was only a fallen spirit, hungry for their obedience, a Maya who had turned from the making of the world to the ruling of it. Fear was his tribute, and belief was his throne, and the distance of these lands from any counsel that might have told them otherwise was the wall that kept them his. And here we must turn softly to a stranger thread in the weave, to a matter that Tolkien himself never wholly settled, that he wrote of in two different ways in 2 different years, and left, in the end, as a shadow with more than one edge. We turn to the coming of the wizards, and to the 2 of them who went into the east and were never clearly seen again. For when the third age was young, and the wise perceived that Sauron's shadow was gathering once more, there came out of the west, across the sea, 5 spirits, 5 of the Maya clothed in the bodies of old men, sent by the Valar not to wield power openly, but to counsel and to kindle, to move the hearts of the free peoples toward their own resistance. The Astari they were called, the wizards. 3 of their names the West would come to know well. There was the Grey, who became the greatest of them, though he seemed the least. There was the White, who was set at their head, and who fell, in time, into the very pride he was sent to oppose. And there was the Brown, who loved the beasts and the growing things, and wandered from the great councils of the world. But there were two others, two of the Istari who did not stay in the west at all, the blue wizards, the histories called them, for the sea blue robes they wore, and their names, in the tongue of the west, were Annatar and Palando. And these two, in the reckoning that Tolkien first set down, passed east with Curanir the White in the early days, and went on into the far lands, beyond Rhûn, and out of the tale of the west they vanished. They did not return to the councils, they sent no word. They dwindled into rumour, and then into silence, and the histories of Gondor and the Shire knew nothing of what became of them. And here is where the shadow shows its two edges. For in one account, the older and the sadder, the fate of the blue wizards was failure. They went into the east to work against Sauron in the very heart of his dominion, and the east was too strong, and too dark, and too far from any help. And so, the account says, they failed. They did not fall as Saruman fell, into open treachery and the lust for the ring, but they were lost in another way, drawn into the very powers they had been sent to undo. It is written that they may have become the founders of secret cults, of hidden magics and dark traditions among the peoples of the East, that the very worship Sauron fed upon may have been shaped in part by the corruption of the two who were sent to break it. A grief if it is true, two spirits sent from the uttermost west, clothed in humility, sent to kindle hope, and lost so far from home that their kindling became a fire of the wrong kind. But Tolkien did not leave it there. In a later writing, in the quieter reconsidering of an old man returning to his own myth, he set down a second and gentler possibility, and moved their coming further back, into the Second Age, into the very years of Sauron's first great wars. And in this telling their errand did not end in failure at all. In this telling, the two who went east did their work in secret, and in silence, unseen and unsung, and they did not fail. They stirred resistance among the peoples of the east and the south. They raised in hidden places revolts against the dark, small kingdoms of refusal, quiet rebellions in lands where no elf or man of the west ever came to help. And by this secret labour, this unseen weakening of Sauron's eastern strength, they lessened the hosts that would otherwise have marched west, so that the numbers that fell upon Gondor and its allies in the last wars were fewer, by some unknown measure, than they might have been. We cannot choose between these tales, and perhaps we are not meant to. Perhaps the truth of the Blue Wizards is meant to remain a thing half seen, a question the histories cannot close, a light or a shadow far off in the east where no clear eye could follow. But hold as you drift this gentler thought, that when the great host of Mordor at last came west and seemed a tide too vast to number, it may already have been thinned quietly by two forgotten friends, labouring in the dark on the far side of the world, whose names no song remembers, who asked for no thanks and received none, and who spent themselves entirely and unwitnessed against the same shadow the west feared. For the east was not only Sauron's country, it was also Cuiviénen's memory, the far waters where the first of the elves awoke, long before the sun and moon were made, beside the still meres in the starlight of the beginning. Somewhere in those eastern lands, drowned now beneath ages and changed beyond finding, lay the cradle of the eldest of the speaking peoples, the place where the world's first song was sung, and the sea of Rhûn, the inland water that lapped the marches of Sauron's reach, was in some old reckonings a last remnant of that primeval mere, a grey memory of the dawn lying quiet at the edge of the shadowed lands. So even the darkest country carried buried in it the oldest light, and the peoples Sauron ruled by fear were the distant kin of those who had first opened their eyes upon the stars. But such memories were long buried, and the will that ruled the east now was neither ancient nor kind. Sauron had counted his eastern strength, the Easterlings and the Wain Riders' heirs, the Variags of Khand, the war hosts and Oliphaunt lords of Harad, the tributary kings and the temple peoples, and the tribes without number that lay beyond the edges of the world the west had mapped. He had weighed them in the balance of his patience and found them ready, and begun to draw them in, tribe by tribe and banner by banner toward the appointed gathering. And so the shadow lengthened westward from the far lands, and the roads of the east grew loud with the sound of moving hosts, and the tribute of 100 peoples began to flow toward a single black gate. We turn now, softly, from the distant countries of his dominion to the near country of his war, from the long, slow gathering of the east and the south to the assembling of that gathering into a single, terrible purpose. We turn to the mustering, to the counting of the spears, to the shaping of the many peoples of the world into the one great host that Sauron would loose upon the last defenders of the West. We turn now, softly, from the mustering of the armies, from the long roads down which the spearmen came, and from the smoke of the war-forges that never cooled, to the land that held them and shaped them and fed them all. For an army is not only its soldiers, an army is the country that carries it, the walls that hide it, the fields that keep it fed. And Sauron, who had learned patience in the ruin of ages, knew this better than any captain who ever lived. So before we speak of the war itself, we walk the length of Mordor quietly, as one walks a sleeping house, and we learn how it was built and why. Mordor was a land shaped like a fortress before ever a hand was laid upon it. It lay in the southeast of Middle-earth, a great sunken plateau ringed on 3 sides by mountains, as though some older power had folded the earth into a wall and left a country hidden behind it. To the north rose the arid Lithui, the Ash Mountains, grey and barren and streaked with old fire. To the west and south ran the Ephel Dúth, the Mountains of Shadow, jagged and toothed and dark, their passes few and their heights unclimbable. Where the 2 ranges met in the northwestern corner, there was a single gap, the only easy way in, and there, in time, the Black Gate would stand. Sauron did not choose this land by accident. He chose it because it was already a prison, and he had only to close the door. Long before, in the elder days, he had ruled here, and then he had been thrown down, and the land had lain empty and watchful under the ash for an age of the world. When he returned quietly, before the wise had named him, he came back to Mordor as a man returns to a house he once owned, knowing every room in the dark, and the first thing he set his servants to was the raising again of the tower. Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. There is no name in the north that carries more dread, and yet its greatness was, in a strange way, a borrowed greatness, for it was not built anew from bare stone. It was raised again upon its own old foundations, the foundations that had been laid in the second age with the power of the One Ring, and because the ring endured, those foundations could not wholly be unmade. This is the secret patience of the thing. When Sauron fell at the end of the second age, the tower above was cast down, its pinnacles broken, its walls thrown into the plain. But the roots of it, bound to the ring, remained in the earth, like the roots of a felled tree that has not truly died. And so, when he came again, he did not begin from nothing. He built upon what could not be undone, and the tower rose faster than any watcher would have believed, black and vast, terrace upon terrace, until its topmost tower held the window of the eye that looked always outward, sleepless, searching, afraid. It is worth resting on that word, afraid, for it is the hidden truth of the whole land. Sauron built Mordor out of fear, and out of fear it was ruled, and fear was not only the weapon he used upon others. Fear was in him also, the long fear of one who had lost the ring and knew that somewhere it endured, the fear of one who could be undone by a thing he could not find. The sigh searched because the will behind it could not rest, and a will that cannot rest builds walls and towers and armies without end, not from strength alone, but from the terror of being caught unready. Around the tower spread the plateau of Gorgoroth, the inner plain, and there is no gentler word for it than desolation. It was a country of ash and cinder and cracked stone, of dead earth heaped in slag. lit not by sun but by the sullen red of Orodruin, the mountain of fire, whose smoke hung always overhead and made a roof of cloud that shut out the honest sky. Nothing grew there that we would call growing. It was a workshop, and a marshalling yard, and a graveyard all at once, and across it ran the roads by which the armies moved, and above those roads stood the watchful towers. For Mordor was watched from within as much as it was walled without. Along the passes and the ridges and the inner ways stood the dark towers of the guard, and the greatest of the western watch were the towers of the teeth, Narcost and Carcost, that flanked the black gate and stared north with lidless windows. These had been raised in the beginning by the men of Gondor, in the days when Gondor was strong, and set a guard upon Mordor to keep the evil shut inside. But Gondor waned, as all the works of men wane, and the watchers grew few, and then grew careless, and then were gone, and the towers that had been built to keep Sauron out were taken by Sauron, and turned about, and used to keep the world from looking in. There is a quiet lesson in that, the kind of thing that returns to you as you drift towards sleep. The strongest wall is only as faithful as the ones who keep it, and a fortress left unwatched becomes a gift to the very thing it was raised against. We turn now, softly, to the question that must come to any who look upon such a land. How was it fed? For a country of ash grows no bread, and an army the size of Sauron's cannot march on shadow. The answer lay in the south, in the one corner of Mordor that was not dead. There in the southeast lay the region of Númenor, and at its heart the great inland water called the Sea of Númenor, bitter and grey, but ringed by soil that could be made to bear. Here were the slave fields of Mordor, worked not by orcs, who neither sow nor reap with patience, but by thralls, by the captured and the conquered, by men and women taken in war and driven south to labour until they died. They tilled the dark fields under the whips of the overseers, and the grain they raised went north, always north, to the war camps of Gorgoroth, to feed the mouths that would one day march against their own kin. Sauron did not free these people, and he did not need to. He needed only their hunger and their fear, and the long habit of despair that grows in those who have no hope of morning. The slave fields of Númenor are seldom sung, and yet without them there would have been no war, for it was their harvest, quiet and endless, that made the armies possible at all. And what of those armies themselves, and the making of them? Sauron was a breeder of creatures, a craftsman of living things twisted to his purpose, and in the last age of his power he brought forth two kinds that the world had not seen in such strength before. The first were the Uruks, the black Uruk-hai of Mordor, greater than the common orcs of the mountains, taller, stronger, hardier, able to endure the light of the sun that the lesser breeds so feared. They came out of the darkness of the tower in the year that Gondor first felt the new shadow, and they were bred for war and for nothing else, disciplined where the mountain orcs were a rabble, obedient where the others were treacherous, a soldiery worthy, in their grim way, of the will that made them. These were the spear point of Mordor's strength, the ones who would carry the assault when the hour came. The second were stranger and more dreadful still, the Aulë, the troll folk of the later days. Trolls of old had been slow and stupid things, and turned to stone in the light of the sun, made in mockery of the Ents, in the deeps of time by a power that could not truly create, but only ruin. But Sauron took the troll kind and bred them anew, in the darkness under his hand, and the Aulë that he brought forth in the ending of the Third Age were quicker of mind and stronger of limb, and able to abide the daylight, so long as the will of their master was upon them. They spoke, if the harsh sounds they made can be called speech, and they wielded great hammers and iron mauls, and where the Uruks were the spear, the Aulë were the ram. That Sauron could do this, could take a made thing and make it again, is the measure of how far his craft had fallen and how deep his malice had grown. He could not make life. He could only capture it, and bend it, and teach it to serve. All his creatures, in the end, were prisoners, as the whole of Mordor was a prison, and their master most of all. We turn now gently to a servant of a different kind, for not all who served the tower were bred in its pits. Some were men, and one man rose higher in that dark service than almost any other, and of him even the histories keep few words, as though the memory itself had been eaten away. He is called only the Mouth of Sauron, the lieutenant of Barad-dûr, and it is written that his own name was forgotten, even by himself. He had been, they say, a living man, a renegade of the black Númenorians, of that proud and fallen kindred of the south, who had turned from the Valar in the days of Númenor's pride and given themselves to the shadow. He came to Mordor when it first rose again, and he served, and in the long years of that service he learned such sorcery and such secrets that he grew great among the servants of the tower, and Sauron trusted him, so far as Sauron trusted anything, and set him over the whole of the dark land as his herald and his voice. And in the giving of himself, he lost himself. His name fell away from him, worn smooth by the years of obedience, until neither he nor any other could name the man he had been before. This too is Mordor's way, told in a single life. The land did not only enslave the bodies of men, it ate their names and their memories and the small true self that each had carried, until nothing remained but the office and the will it served. He was no longer a person who spoke for Sauron. He was the mouth, and only the mouth, and the man had gone out of it entirely. There remains one corner of the border we have not walked, and it is the strangest of all, for it was guarded not by loyal servants, but by an old and hungry thing that Sauron neither made nor commanded, and yet was glad to have. High in the Ethel Duath, in the western wall of shadow, there was a pass, the pass of Cirith Ungol, the cleft above which stood one of the watchtowers of the guard. It was a secret way, difficult and dark, and by rights it should have been the weak seam in Mordor's armour, the one door the enemy might slip through unseen. But it was not weak, because something lived in the tunnels beneath it, in the black winding ways that the pass ran through, and that thing was Shelob. She was a spider, if so poor a word can hold her, but no common spider of field or wood. She was ancient, older than Sauron's return, older perhaps than his first rising, a last child of Ungoliant, that nameless horror out of the uttermost dark of the elder days who had drunk the light of the two trees. Shelob had crept into the mountains long ago and made her lair, and there she dwelt and fed, weaving her webs across the secret pass and taking whatever wandered into them, orc and beast and stray traveller alike. She served no one. She hated all life but her own hunger. And yet Sauron, in his cold wisdom, did not seek to drive her out or destroy her. He let her stay, for she was the best of all border guards, an unruly and unbought sentinel who watched his weakest gate more surely than any loyal captain, and asked no wage but the meat that came to her. He called her, in his private mockery, his cat, and he fed her now and then with prisoners, and she kept the pass of Cirith Ungol, as no army could have kept it, precisely because she could not be reasoned with, or bribed, or turned. Here again is the deep pattern of the place. Mordor was strongest, not where it was ordered, but where it was terrible, and its surest wall was an old fear coiled in the dark, and so we have walked the whole of it, quietly, from the raised tower to the ashen plain, from the watchful teeth of the northern gate to the slave fields of the bitter southern sea, from the bred soldiery of the pits to the nameless herald at the throne, and at the last to the spider in the mountain wall. And in all of it we have found one thing repeated softly in every corner. Fear was the architecture of Mordor. Fear raised the tower and fear kept it. Fear drove the harvests north and the armies out. Fear was in the master, and fear was in the made things, and fear stood watch where no faithful watcher could be found. It was a land held together by dread, as other lands are held by love, and that perhaps was the whole of its weakness, though the wise did not yet see it. A thing built wholly of fear has nothing beneath it but fear, and fear, when it is finally faced, does not hold. But that hour was not yet. The walls stood, the fields bore, the armies grew, and the eyes searched, and in the halls of the tower a will without rest turned again to the one thing it had never ceased to want. We turn now, softly, from the anatomy of the land to the gathering of the storm, from Mordor at rest behind its mountains to Mordor reaching outward at last. For the years of waiting were ending, and the War of the Ring was near. From the summit of Barad-dûr, where the great eye kept its sleepless vigil above the ash-choked plains, Sauron looked out upon the world. He meant to gather again beneath his hand, and in that looking he was patient, methodical, and terribly sure. He had waited long ages for the smallest tremor in the deep, and now the tremor had come, for the ring, his ring, the ring he had poured his cruelty and his craft and his own diminished self into, had stirred somewhere in the wide lands beyond his walls. He felt it as a man feels the memory of a savoured limb, an ache that is also a hunger, and he turned all his thought toward it. He did not doubt. Doubt was not in his nature, or rather, it had been burned out of him long ago in the fires of his own certainty. He believed the world to be as he was, greedy for dominion, sleepless with the wish to rule, and he read every heart he could not see by the measure of his own. And so he reasoned as a lord of power reasons. The ring had surfaced. Whoever held it would use it, must use it. For who could hold such a thing and not be mastered by the wanting of it? He looked to his enemies, to the wise of Rivendell and the proud of Gondor, and he thought, this one will seize it, or that one, and set himself upon a throne against me, and I shall know him by his rising. He watched for a rival. He watched for a captain crowned in stolen fire. He never once watched the road that led down into the dark, toward the mountain of his own making, in the hands of the small. He sent the 9, the Nazgûl, the ring-wraiths, kings of men long swallowed into the wearing of their lesser rings, riders robed in nothing, hollow and cold and bound wholly to his will. He loosed them out of the black gate and set their faces toward the north and west, toward a green and quiet country, whose name he had wrung from a broken creature in his pits. To the Shire they rode, to the land of the halflings, and the world shrank before them as they passed, the birds falling silent, the horses screaming in the fields, a chill going before them like the breath of the grave. Sauron did not think of the Shire as a place. He thought of it as a coordinate, a point upon the map where his ache converged, and he trusted the terror of his servants to close the distance and bring the ring home. But the 9 were creatures of dread and not of subtlety, and dread, for all its weight, cannot find what hides in ordinary shadow. They harried and they hunted, they drove the ring-bearer and his companions across wild lands, and at the last they closed upon the fords of Bruinen below Rivendell, where the road crosses the running water. There the wraiths pressed hard, their captain calling out in the tongue of Mordor, their blades reaching for the wounded halfling upon the far bank. And there the river rose. Elrond, who commanded those waters, sent them down in a flood shaped like white horses, with manes of foam, and the torrent took the 9, swept away their steeds, unhorsed them, and undid their crossing. Their forms endured, for they could not truly die, but they were scattered and unmade for a season, sent naked and slow back to their master to be clothed and mounted anew. Sauron felt the failure as a distant blow, an interruption rather than a defeat. He gathered his wraiths and gave them steeds of the air, winged and foul, that they might range farther and higher, and he narrowed his attention, and still he did not perceive the true shape of the thing arrayed against him. The council had met at Rivendell. The choice had been made, and the choice was of a kind his mind could not frame. For they had resolved not to wield the ring, but to destroy it, to carry it into the heart of his own realm, and cast it down into the fire from which it came. This was the one stroke against which he had built no wall, for it required his enemies to desire the very opposite of power, to walk toward weakness, to spend everything and keep nothing. He could not conceive it because he could not feel it, and what a heart cannot feel, it cannot guard against. We turn now softly to the stone. For Sauron had another instrument, older and more insidious than any host of orcs, and it was the Palantir, the seeing stone. Long ago the Númenorians had brought 7 such stones out of the drowned west, spheres of dark crystal that could speak one to another across the leagues, so that a watcher in one tower might behold the light of a distant hall. In the fall of years some were lost, and some were kept, and one, the stone of Minas Ithil, had passed into Sauron's keeping when that city became Minas Morgul. Through it he could reach the other stones that remained, and bend the wills that dared to gaze in. In the tower of Orthanc at Isengard sat Saruman, chief of the Order of Wizards, wise and proud and curious beyond his wisdom, and there beneath his roof lay the Palantir of Orthanc. Saruman looked into it, seeking knowledge, seeking to measure the strength of the enemy, thinking himself the master of the exchange. But no mind matches Sauron in a contest of the stones. For behind the stone of Ithil stood a will forged in the deeps of time. Little by little, gaze by gaze, Saruman was drawn into the orbit of that will. He was not commanded outright. He was seduced, shown enough truth to make him despair of resistance, flattered with visions of the order he might keep if he served the strength that was surely coming. And so the White Wizard turned, and made himself a lesser Sauron in the north, breeding his own armies, coveting the ring for himself, even as he bent to the one who would never share it. Sauron did not fully trust him. Sauron trusted no one, but a corrupted rival is a useful rival, and he let Saruman labour and watched and waited. There was a third gaze, and it was the saddest of the 3. Far south in Gondor, in the deep places of Minas Tirith, the stewards kept the stone of Anor, hidden and unused, its peril half forgotten. But Denethor, steward of the city, a man of high and failing lineage, strong of will, and heavy with the burden of a besieged realm, took up the stone, in his grief and his pride, and looked. He was strong enough that Sauron could not master him outright, nor turn him to open treason. But Sauron was strong enough to choose what Denethor would see. And so, through the seeing stone, the enemy showed the steward truth after truth, each one shorn of hope. He showed him the numberless hosts of Mordor. He showed him the black fleets upon the river. He showed him the strength of the west dwindling, the walls thinning, the years running out. Every image was real, and every image was chosen to break a proud man slowly, to wither his courage from within, while leaving him certain he saw clearly. Denethor did not know he was being poisoned. He thought he was being wise, and drop by drop, gaze by gaze, the great steward slid toward despair, and Sauron, without a single lie, prepared the ruin of the mind that should have led the city's defence. We turn now, gently, from the strategy to the storm, from the tower where the eye kept watch to the fields, where its shadow at last poured forth. For all the threads were drawing tight, and Sauron, sure of his reading of the world, sure that force and fear and the hunger for power would carry the day, made ready to strike the blow he had waited an age to strike. He did not know that his certainty was the very door left open. He did not know that far below his notice, upon a road of ash, 2 small figures were climbing toward the one place he could not afford to lose. The hour came, and Sauron struck at Gondor. He had long prepared it, and now he loosed it, the whole weight of Mordor bent upon the white city of Minas Tirith, last great fortress of the men of the West. Out of Minas Morgul rode the Lord of the Nazgul, captain of the Nine, the Witch King, upon whom Sauron had laid a portion of his own terror, and behind him came the legions, orcs in their tens of thousands, trolls of the black breeding, men of the south and east marching beneath strange banners, and above them the winged shadows wheeled and shrieked. Sauron watched it all through the eye and through his servants, and he was pleased, for this was the shape of victory, as he understood it, an overwhelming of the enemy by numbers and by dread, a city drowned in the sheer mass of his malice. He sent the darkness first. Out of Mordor there flowed a great gloom, a cloud without edge that his craft had gathered and thickened, and it crept across the sky and swallowed the sun, so that the men of Gondor woke into a day that was not day, a dim and starless twilight, in which hope itself seemed harder to hold. This was deliberate. Sauron knew that men fight worse in the dark, that courage is fed by light, and so he stole the morning from them before he struck. The siege closed. The great engines came up, the towers and the rams, the hurled fire, and against the gate his captain brought a weapon of sorcery, a battering ram named in the old dark speech, and with words of ruin the Witch King broke the gate of the city that had never been broken. Sauron, watching, felt the nearness of the end he desired. One city, one night, and the West would have no wall left standing. But even as the gate fell, there came into the field things his strategy had not counted. For the riders of Rohan came down out of the north, with the dawn breaking behind them, against his own darkness. And horns blew, and the tide that had seemed sure to swallow the city was met and thrown into confusion. And upon the field, the Lord of the Nazgul, his greatest servant, the terror on whom no living man could lay hand, was brought down, undone by a woman and a halfling, slain against all the prophecies of his invulnerability. Sauron felt the passing of that servant like a nerve cut, a lessening of himself, and for the first time a thin thread of unease ran through his certainty. Yet he did not waver. He had more captains, more legions, more darkness to spend. He drew fresh strength up from the deep and pressed on. And then the stone showed him a face. In the tower of Orthanc, the Palantir had passed by chance into other hands, and a man dared to wrestle with Sauron through it, to master the seeing stone that Sauron had bent to his own uses for long years. The man was Aragorn, heir of Isildur, of the line of the kings that Sauron had thought broken and scattered beyond recovering. And Aragorn showed himself. He turned the stone by his own right and his own strength, for it was his by lineage, and he let the enemy behold him, and he let the enemy see the sword that had cut the ring from Sauron's hand ages before, reforged now and shining, held by one who claimed the crown. This Sauron understood. This fit the world as he knew it. Here at last was the rival he had watched for from the beginning, the captain risen to seize the ring and set himself upon a throne. He read the vision exactly as Aragorn hoped he would read it, for the heir of Isildur had chosen to reveal himself precisely to feed the enemy's certainty, to make Sauron believe that the ring was going to Gondor to crown a king. And Sauron, seeing his oldest fear take flesh, moved to meet it. He hastened his war. He threw his strength forward before he was fully ready, striking to crush this claimant before the ring could be turned against him. His very confidence made him hasty, and his haste was the trap. For the captains of the West, few and weary, and knowing they could never win by arms, chose then to do a mad and desperate thing. They gathered what host remained to them, a small thing against the might of Mordor, and they marched it up to the very threshold of the Black Gate, to the Morannon, and there they stood and offered battle, a challenge no sane commander would give. They meant to be a lure. They meant to draw the eye wholly to themselves, to pull every watching thought of Sauron toward the noise and the glitter at his gate, so that he would empty his lands and stare outward and never look down at the quiet slope of the mountain behind him. And Sauron took the bait, for it confirmed everything he believed. Here was the rival, come with his little army and his reforged sword to dare the master of the world at his own door. It was arrogant, it was doomed. It was exactly what a hungry heart would do. He gathered his hosts before the gate to swallow them whole, and in that moment, at the very peak of his certainty, something turned in Sauron that he had not felt in an age, a shadow of doubt. For as he bent his whole will upon the gate, and the mockery of an army before it, a thought brushed the edge of his mind, a cold breath of a possibility he had refused to hold, that perhaps, the thing he loved was not being carried toward a throne at all. But the thought was too vast and too dreadful to complete, and he was too near his triumph, and he pushed it down and struck. Then far behind him, upon the mountain, in the chamber where the fires ran, the moment came that unmade him. The ring-bearer had climbed to the Sammath Naur, the very heart of Mount Doom, the one place in all the world where the ring could be destroyed, and had stood at the edge of the fire. And there at the last, the halfling's strength failed, as any strength would fail so near that power, and he claimed the ring for his own, and set it upon his hand. And Sauron knew. In a single searing instant, the whole of his attention was wrenched from the gate, and flung inward and downward, and he understood everything at once, complete and total, and too late. He saw the road he had never watched. He saw the small hands that had carried his death across his own country while he stared at a lure. He saw the mountain and the fire and the folly of every certainty he had built, all of it collapsing into one white blaze of horror. His mind cried out. His will screamed toward the mountain, calling his wraiths, calling all his thought back from the war to save the one thing he could not lose. But it was already ended. The ring passed into the fire, whether by the last struggle of desperate creatures or by a mercy woven into the deeps of the world, and the fire took it and unmade with it all the strength and cruelty and self that Sauron had poured into its making so long ago. And in that instant he was undone. The great tower shook and fell. The eye that had kept its sleepless watch guttered and went out. And up from the ruin of Barad-dûr there rose a vast dark shape, a shadow lifting into the sky, stretching out a great hand toward the west, as if to seize the world one final time. A cold wind came and bent it back, and it dissolved. It was a nothing carried away upon the air, a smoke without substance, a will with nothing left to will. He did not die, for he had never truly lived as living things live. But he was spent utterly, scattered so thin across the world that he could never again take shape, never again lift a hand, never again be more than a rumour of malice in the dark corners of the earth. The shadow passed. The darkness he had drawn across the sky thinned and broke, and the true dawn came through, and the sun stood at last over the field where his hosts, their master gone, their will unbound, broke and fled and fell. The great enemy of the age who had schemed through millennia, who had corrupted kings and drowned islands and forged an age of fear, ended not with a clash of arms, but with the quiet fall of a small thing into fire and the passing of a shadow upon the wind. We turn now softly toward reflection, toward the long quiet that follows the storm, for his shadow is gone from the towers and the plains, and the world lies still beneath a cleaner sky, and there remains only the telling of what it all was and what it meant, the slow gathering up of a story that began before the shaping of the lands and ended in a single falling ember. Rest now in that stillness, in the calm after the great malice, and we will speak gently and without haste of the meaning of the shadow that has passed. We come now softly to the meaning of it all, to the long shape of a single spirit across the ages of the world, and to the quiet tragedy that lies beneath the terror of his name. For Sauron was not, in the first making of him, a thing of dread. He was one of the Maiar, the lesser spirits who came into being at the thought of Ilúvatar before the shaping of the world, and among them he was accounted mighty, wise and skilled beyond most of his kind. In the beginning he loved order, and he loved craft, and he loved the swift and perfect accomplishment of design. These were not evils in themselves. They were, in their first flowering, near cousins to the very virtues that make a maker great. It is one of the deep sorrows woven through Tolkien's world that the greatest of the fallen did not begin in malice. Sauron came at the last into the service of Melkor, the first and mightiest of the rebels, but the road that led him there was paved at its outset with a love that had turned. He desired that the world should be well ordered, that waste and confusion and the slow fumbling of free things should be swept away and made efficient, made obedient, made perfect according to a single will. And because Melkor seemed, in those early days, to have the power to bring such swiftness and such order into being, Sauron gave himself to that greater darkness, and so the servant of order became the servant of tyranny. Here is the first thread of his diminishment, and it is a subtle one. To love order more than freedom is already to have begun the long fall, for the ordering of others against their will is not peace but bondage, and the perfection that is imposed is not beauty but a cage. Sauron could not see this or would not, and in his blindness he mistook domination for harmony and control for care. He would have said, had you asked him in the elder days, that he wished only to heal the marring of the world and to make the crooked straight, but the healing he offered was the healing of the shackle, and the straightness he desired was the straightness of the road that leads only where the master wills. Consider then the shape of his defeats, for each one stripped from him something he had loved, and in the losing he was made ever smaller, ever narrower, ever more wholly bound to the single naked hunger for mastery that was, at the last, all that remained of him. At the first he wore fair forms, and could seem wise and gracious, and could walk among the elves of Eregion as a friend and a teacher, calling himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. In that guise he was beautiful, and his counsel was subtle, and his hands were cunning at the forge, and he gave freely of his knowledge, so that he might, in the giving, weave the beginning of the great deceit. This was the height of his power to charm, the season in which he could still wear the mask of the benefactor and be believed. And it was, we may say, the last age in which anything of the first Sauron, the lover of craft and making, could still be glimpsed beneath the mask. Then came the drowning of Númenor, and the first great stripping away. For Sauron had gone as a captive and a counsellor into the island kingdom of men, and there he had poisoned the hearts of the mighty, and turned them against the Valar, and led them at the last to break the ban, and sail against the undying lands. In the ruin that followed, when Númenor was swallowed by the sea, and the world was bent and made round, Sauron's body was destroyed in the cataclysm, and he could never again take a form that was fair to look upon. The mask of Annatar was lost forever beneath the waves. Never again could he seem gracious or beautiful or kindly. From that day he could clothe himself only in a shape of menace and dread, and the fairness that had been his greatest weapon was gone from him utterly. Mark the pattern in it. The first defeat took his beauty and left him only terror, and terror, though it is a mighty thing, is a poorer thing than beauty, for beauty can persuade the willing, but terror can only compel the fearful, and the compelled will always, in the end, seek their escape. Then came the last alliance of elves and men, and the second great stripping away, for after the fall of Númenor Sauron rose again in Middle-earth, and made war, and was met at the last by the joined might of Gil-galad and Elendil upon the slopes of Orodruin. There he was thrown down, and his body was destroyed a second time, and Isildur cut the ruling ring from his hand. Now Sauron could take no bodily shape at all for long ages, but was reduced to a formless shadow, a malice without hand or face, a will that could only brood and wait, and slowly, slowly gather itself again. The second defeat took his form. He who had walked in beauty and then in dread, was now no more than a breath of darkness clinging to the hollow places of the world. And then came Orodruin the second time, the cracks of doom, the unmaking of the ring in the fire where it was made, and this was the third and final stripping away, and it took from him everything that remained. For Sauron had poured so much of his native strength into the One Ring, had bound so much of his own being into that small circle of gold, that when it was unmade, he was unmade with it. The shadow that had brooded, the will that had gathered, the malice that had schemed across an age of the world, was scattered upon the wind, and rendered impotent forever. He did not die as living things die, for he was a spirit and could not truly perish, but he was diminished past all recovery, reduced to a helpless and hateful thing that could never again take shape, never again raise a hand, never again trouble the world he had so long desired to rule. He became, in the words of the old law, a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows, but can never again grow or take form. Here is the whole arc of him, laid bare. He began as a spirit of great gifts who loved order and craft. He lost his goodness to the love of domination. He lost his beauty to the sea. He lost his form to the sword. He lost all that remained to the fire. Each defeat carved something away, and nothing was ever given back, and at the end there was nothing left but the hunger itself, naked and starving and forever unfed. And in this Tolkien set down one of his deepest convictions concerning the nature of evil, which is this: evil cannot create, it can only corrupt and mock and unmake. Sauron, in all his long ages, never brought a single new and beautiful thing into the world. The orcs were not his making, but Melkor's marring of things that Ilúvatar had made. The ring was a work of terrible craft, but it was a thing of binding and theft, a vessel for seizing the wills of others, and not a work of free and joyous creation. Everything Sauron wrought was a twisting of what already was, a shadow cast by a light he did not himself kindle. For creation, in Tolkien's world, belongs only to the good, to the sub-creators who make in wonder and give their work away in freedom, and evil, for all its power, remains forever barren, forever parasitic, forever dependent upon the good things it can only spoil and never father. And so the tragedy of Sauron is the tragedy of a great gift turned wholly to ruin, of a spirit that might have been among the makers of the world and chose instead to be its jailer, of a mind of surpassing skill that spent itself across 3 ages and built, in the end, nothing that endured. The towers fell, the armies scattered, the ring melted into the fire of the mountain, and of all his long labour there remained only the healing of the lands he had striven to enslave, and the peace of the free peoples he had striven to bind, and the quiet return of the light to places where his shadow had lain. He wished to be the master of all things, and he became, at the last, the measure of how little mastery avails against the smallest act of pity, and the quietest faithfulness, and the humblest love. We turn now gently away from the long history and its sorrow, and let the world settle into the stillness that came after. For the shadow is gone now, and the age of Sauron is ended, and there begins the 4th age, the age of men, and of the fading of the elves, the long quiet dawn that followed the breaking of the darkness. Breathe softly now, and let the story loosen its hold, and let the mind drift down like a leaf turning slowly towards still water. The armies of Mordor that had stood as one dreadful will fell suddenly to pieces when that will was unmade, and fled and scattered like dust upon the wind, and were no more a terror in the world. The great gate of the Black Land stood open and empty. Barad-dûr, the dark tower, that had risen stone upon cursed stone, through long ages of malice, trembled and cracked and fell, and its foundations were laid bare, and the land beneath the shadow began slowly, in the fullness of years, to remember how to be green. The quiet lands are healing now. In Ithilien, the garden of Gondor that the shadow had long befouled, the flowers return, and the streams run clear, and the fair trees put out their leaves again in the warm airs of the south. In the fields of the Pelennor, where so many fell, the grass grows green over the barrows, and the wind moves gently through it, and there is peace where there was slaughter. Far away in the north, the small quiet country of the Shire, that scarcely knew how near the darkness had come, keeps its ordinary happiness, and its ordinary comforts, and its ordinary and unremarkable joys, which were, in truth, the very things worth all the saving. And now, as the story ends and the age turns, let it come nearer to you, and let it fold you gently into itself, into a Middle Earth at rest. The war is over. The ring is gone. There is nothing left to fear, and nothing left to guard against, and nothing that asks anything of you now but that you should rest. The lamps of the Shire are lit, one window and then another, warm and golden in the blue of the evening, and the smoke rises straight and unhurried from the round chimneys, and somewhere a kettle sings, and somewhere a door is closed softly against the cool of the night. The evening deepens over the quiet lands, the last light fades from the tops of the far mountains, and the first stars open in the darkening sky. The same stars the elves loved and named in the elder days, kindled long ago and burning still, steady and serene, above a world at last set free. Let your breathing slow to match the slow turning of that sky. Breathe in gently and let it go. Breathe in and let it go. The paths are all quiet now. The great deeds are done, and the great names are passing into song. And there is nothing more that must be carried, and nothing more that must be feared, and nothing more that the night requires of you but stillness. Let the weight of the day loosen from your shoulders, as a traveller at journey's end sets down a heavy pack beside a warm hearth. You have come far enough. You are safe here, in the quiet of the westward evening, where the sea sighs softly against the shore, and the wind comes gentle off the water. Let the quiet of the westward sea carry you now. Let it lift you as easily as it lifts the white ships that slip out from the grey havens under the evening star, unhurried, without sorrow, gliding out upon still water toward a light beyond the edge of the world. There is no farewell in it now, only rest, only the soft sound of water and the soft fall of your own breathing, slower and slower, deeper and deeper, as the shore falls away behind and the gentle dark comes down like a warm and folded blanket over all the world. Breathe in softly and let it go. The lamps are dim now and the fire is low, and the last quiet murmur of the story fades into the sound of the sea. The shadow is gone. The world is at peace, and you are held gently in the stillness at the end of all the long ages, where nothing can trouble you and nothing can reach you, and there is only rest and rest and rest. Sleep now. The tale is told and the night is yours, and Middle-earth keeps its quiet watch around you until the morning. Good night. If you drifted off before the end, tell me in the comments how many nights in a row you have fallen asleep here, and come back tomorrow night, and we will begin another tale together in the quiet.